Lightning cracked across the black sky, and Elena Voss was already running before the thunder answered it. Her bare feet tore against frozen roots and broken stone, but she did not stop. Behind her, the torches of the Blackthorn pack still burned at the ceremony grounds, and behind those torches stood every wolf who had just watched Beta Marcus turn his back on her in front of the whole pack. The word rejected still rang in her ears, louder than the storm. She had believed, for one foolish year, that Marcus loved her. She had believed the bond between them meant something. Instead, in front of elders, hunters, and pups too young to understand what they were seeing, Marcus had looked straight through her and said the words that severed a mate bond forever. "I reject you as my mate, Elena Voss." The pack had gone silent. Then it had turned away from her, the way a pack always turns away from an omega with no one left to claim her. Now the forest swallowed her whole, and the storm did not care that she had nowhere else to go. Rain came down in cold sheets, soaking through the thin ceremony dress she still wore. Her wolf clawed at the inside of her chest, desperate to shift and run on 4 legs instead of 2, but the rejection had left her too raw, too weak to call the change. Bond loss did that. It stole strength from an omega, the way winter stole warmth from the ground. She kept walking anyway, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the way the whole pack had looked at her, like she was already gone. The trees grew taller and closer together the farther she went, blotting out what little moonlight tried to break through the clouds. She had no plan. She only knew that Blackthorn territory could not hold her anymore, not tonight, maybe not ever again. An omega without a mate and without pack favor was a target for every rogue wolf between here and the coast. She knew that. She kept walking anyway. It was somewhere past the second ridge, with her lips numb and her hands shaking too hard to feel the scrapes on them, that she heard it. A howl. Not just any howl. It came rolling down through the storm like something ancient waking up, deep and silver-toned, cutting clean through the crash of thunder the way a blade cuts through fog. Elena stopped walking. Every hair on her arms rose, and not from the cold. She had heard hundreds of howls in her life, pack howls, calling wolves home for a hunt, alpha howls, sharp and commanding, pup howls, thin and playful. This was none of those. This howl did not sound like it was calling anyone home. It sounded like it was calling her specifically, though that made no sense at all. Her wolf, exhausted and bruised from rejection, lifted its head inside her chest for the first time since the ceremony. It was not fear that moved through her. It was recognition, sudden and strange, like meeting the eyes of someone she had known in another life and forgotten. She told herself it was nothing. Wolves howled in storms all the time, warning each other, marking territory, calling packmates. She told herself that twice more before her feet started moving again, not away from the sound, but toward it. It was not a smart choice. She understood that even as she made it. An omega alone in unclaimed territory had no business following an unknown wolf's voice through a storm that could kill her before morning. But something about the howl pulled at a thread she did not know existed inside her, tugging gently, insistently, the way the moon pulls at the tide without asking permission. She climbed over slick stone and pushed through wet branches that clawed at her arms. The howl came again, closer now, lower, almost mournful, as if the wolf making it carried its own kind of pain. Elena found that she understood that pain. She had a matching one of her own, freshly carved into her chest an hour ago. Thunder rolled overhead, so close now that the ground seemed to shiver with it. Rain turned to something closer to ice, stinging her cheeks. She should have turned back. She should have found any kind of shelter and waited out the storm alone, the way an omega with no pack was supposed to survive. Instead, she kept climbing toward the sound of a voice that felt, impossibly, like it already knew her name. When she crested the final ridge, lightning split the sky wide open, and for one long white second, she saw the whole valley below her lit up like day. There was nothing there. No wolf, no shelter, only broken stone, the crumbled shape of what might once have been a watchtower, and endless black trees stretching toward a horizon she could not see. The howl had gone silent. She stood there, soaked through, shaking, wondering if she had imagined the whole thing out of desperation and grief. Then, from somewhere down in the ruins, she heard something else. Not a howl this time. A low, ragged sound, more breath than voice. The sound an injured animal makes when it thinks no one is listening. Her instincts, the ones bred into every wolf regardless of rank, told her to run the other way. An injured wolf was often a dangerous one, especially a stranger's wolf in unclaimed territory. But the sound tugged at the same thread the howl had, and Elena had already lost everything a wolf was supposed to protect that night. She had very little left to lose. She went down into the ruins. The old watchtower had mostly collapsed, its stones scattered and half swallowed by moss and root, but one corner still stood, and beneath a slab of broken roof, sheltered just barely from the worst of the rain, lay a wolf, larger than any Elena had ever seen in her life. His fur was the color of moonlight on water, a deep silver that seemed to hold its own glow, even in the darkness of the storm. He was easily twice the size of any wolf in the Blackthorn pack, his shoulders broad enough that Elena, small even by Omega standards, could have curled up entirely within the shadow of his body. Blood matted the fur along his side, dark and slow-moving in the rain, and one of his front legs was tucked awkwardly beneath him. He was breathing hard. His eyes, when they found her, were a pale, striking gold, sharp with pain, but sharper still, with an intelligence that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. This was not an ordinary wolf. She did not know how she knew that, only that some deep animal part of her recognized power when it saw it, the way a small creature senses a storm before the clouds arrive. She should have run. Every instinct bred into an Omega for 1,000 years told her to run from an injured, unknown wolf of this size, this strength, this rank she could not even guess at. Instead, she found herself crouching slowly at the edge of the broken roof, palms open, the way her mother had taught her to approach a frightened animal when she was small. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said, though her voice shook so badly the words barely carried over the rain. "I don't think I could, even if I wanted to." The great silver wolf watched her with those gold eyes, his chest rising and falling in short, careful breaths. He did not growl, he did not lunge, he simply watched her, as though he too recognized something in her that he could not explain, and for reasons neither of them understood, that recognition was enough to hold them both still in the storm. Elena moved closer, slow enough that he could have stopped her a dozen times over if he wanted to. He didn't. When she reached his side and saw the wound properly, a long, deep gash across his ribs, still bleeding despite the rain trying to wash it clean, her stomach turned. This was not an accidental injury. This looked like the mark of claws, deliberate and vicious, the kind of wound made by another wolf who meant to kill. "Someone did this to you," she whispered. The wolf's ears flattened, just slightly, and something like understanding passed through his gold eyes. Whatever had happened to him, he remembered it, and the memory clearly cost him something. Elena had no herbs, no bandages, nothing but the torn hem of her ceremony dress and whatever the forest floor could offer her. She tore a long strip of fabric from her skirt without hesitation, the elegant cloth that had been chosen so carefully for a ceremony meant to bond her to Marcus forever, and pressed it hard against the wound. The wolf flinched, a low sound escaping him that was almost a whimper, but he did not pull away. "I know it hurts," she said softly, the way she might speak to a frightened pup. "I'm sorry, I'm trying to help." She worked quickly, despite her shaking hands, binding the wound as tightly as she could manage, with what little she had. She found a patch of yarrow growing wild near a cracked stone nearby, more from memory of her mother's teachings than any real skill, and packed a rough poultice of crushed leaves against the deepest part of the gash, before securing the last of her torn dress over it. Through it all, the silver wolf watched her without moving, his gold eyes tracking every motion of her hands, as if trying to understand not just what she was doing, but why a stranger, soaked and shivering and freshly rejected by her own mate, would kneel in the mud of a ruined watchtower to save a wolf she had never met. When she finally sat back, exhausted, the adrenaline that had carried her through the storm finally beginning to fade, she realized how cold she truly was. Her whole body shook now, teeth chattering, fingers gone stiff and clumsy. She had given away the last dry portion of her dress to bind a stranger's wound, and she had nothing left to warm herself. The wolf seemed to understand this too. Slowly, wincing with the effort, he shifted his enormous body, just enough to open a space beside him, sheltered beneath the broken slab of roof, away from the worst of the wind and rain. He tilted his great head toward the space, an unmistakable invitation, and made a low sound in his throat that was almost gentle. Elena hesitated only a moment, Every rule she had ever learned about caution around unfamiliar wolves argued against what she was about to do. But the storm was not going to stop, and she had nowhere else to go, and something about this wolf, wounded and strange and impossibly calm, felt safer to her in that moment than the pack she had just fled. She curled into the space beside him, careful to keep her weight off his injured side, and felt the extraordinary heat radiating from his massive body seep into her frozen skin. He was warm in a way that felt almost unnatural, like a hearth fire rather than a living animal, and despite every reason she had to stay alert and wary, exhaustion pulled at her almost immediately. The last thing she registered before sleep took her was the steady rhythm of his breathing beside her, slower now, calmer, as though her presence had settled something in him the way his warmth had settled something in her. Outside, the storm raged on, but beneath the broken stone of the old watchtower, for the first time since the ceremony had ended her old life, Elena Voss did not feel entirely alone. She did not dream of Marcus. She did not dream of the pack's silence, or the humiliation of the rejection ceremony. Instead, she dreamed of silver fur and gold eyes, and a howl that had called to her across a storm, as though it had been waiting for her all along. And though she would not understand the truth of that dream for many days yet, some quiet, ancient part of her already did. Morning came slow and gray, the storm finally spent, leaving behind a hush over the forest that felt almost sacred. Elena woke stiff and sore, the ground hard beneath her, but warm, still warm, because the great silver wolf had not moved from her side through the night. His breathing was steadier now, less ragged, and when her eyes opened, his gold ones were already open too, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch all over again. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Elena studied him in the pale morning light, the size of him even more astonishing now that she could see him clearly, the strange, unnatural shimmer to his silver coat that caught the light like something enchanted. He was beautiful in a way that felt dangerous, the way a blade is beautiful, or a storm. "Who are you?" she whispered, more to herself than to him, not expecting an answer. He gave her one anyway, though not in words. He shifted his weight, careful of his wound, and pressed the top of his massive head gently against her shoulder, a gesture so unexpectedly tender from a creature of his size that tears rose unbidden in her eyes before she understood why. She did not know his name. She did not know his pack, his rank, or why he had been attacked so viciously in unclaimed territory. She did not know, could not have possibly known, that the wolf resting his head against her shoulder in the ruins of a forgotten watchtower was the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, a king in hiding from traitors within his own court, and that the howl she had followed through the storm had not been random at all. She only knew that for the first time since the ceremony had stripped her of everything she thought she was. Something in this broken, silver-eyed stranger made her feel, impossibly, seen. She sat up slowly, testing her stiff limbs, and looked around the ruins in the honest light of morning. The watchtower had clearly once been part of something grander, a border post perhaps, built long before any pack she knew of had claimed this stretch of forest. Vines had grown thick over the fallen stones, and moss softened every sharp edge, as though the land itself had decided to forgive whatever battle had once been fought here. Her stomach twisted with hunger, sharp and sudden, reminding her that she had not eaten since before the ceremony. She had fled with nothing, not even a coin or a blanket, only the dress on her back, and half of that was now wrapped around the wolf's ribs. She glanced at him, embarrassed by the sound her stomach had made, but he only tilted his head, watching her with what she could have sworn was concern. "I'll find something," she said, more to reassure herself than him. "There has to be berries somewhere close, or a stream at least. Don't move too much. I don't want that wound opening again." He made a low sound, almost a protest, as she rose to her feet, and for a moment she thought he might try to follow her despite his injury. But when she held up a hand, palm out, the same gesture she had used the night before, he settled back down, gold eyes tracking her every step as she picked her way out of the ruins. The forest smelled different after the storm, washed clean and sharp with the scent of wet bark and crushed leaves. Elena moved carefully, listening for the sound of running water, and found a narrow stream not far from the ruins, swollen from the night's rain, but calm enough to drink from safely. She cupped her hands and drank deeply, the cold water shocking her fully awake, before searching the banks for anything edible. She found a small patch of wild berries growing along a fallen log, not enough to make a real meal, but enough to ease the worst of the hunger gnawing at her. She ate a handful herself, and gathered the rest carefully in the remaining fold of her skirt, thinking of the wolf waiting for her back in the ruins, though she had no idea if berries would even interest a creature that size. As she knelt by the stream, she caught her own reflection in the still water at the edge of the current, and for a moment, she barely recognized herself. Her hair, usually carefully braided for pack gatherings, hung in tangled, dirt-streaked waves around her face. There were scratches along her arms, from the branches she had pushed through in the dark, and her eyes looked hollow in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. This was the face of someone who had lost everything in a single evening, and yet, strangely, staring back at her, she did not look as broken as she had expected. Something had shifted in her overnight, something she could not name yet. Perhaps it was simply the shock of survival, the animal satisfaction of having lived through a night that should have destroyed her, or perhaps it was something else entirely, something tied to gold eyes and silver fur, and a howl that had reached into her chest and pulled her forward when every instinct should have told her to run the other way. She made her way back to the ruins slowly, watching the trees for any sign of danger. Blackthorn hunting parties sometimes patrolled territory near their borders, and though she doubted anyone would come looking for a rejected omega, old habits died hard. She kept to the shadows out of instinct alone. When she reached the watchtower again, she found the great wolf exactly where she had left him, though his eyes had followed her the entire final stretch of her approach, alert despite his injury. She knelt beside him, and offered the berries in her cupped palms, feeling faintly foolish as she did it. "I don't know if this is even food to you," she admitted, "but it's what I found." To her surprise, he lowered his massive head, and ate carefully from her hands, his teeth astonishingly gentle against her palms despite their size. Something about the trust in that small gesture, a wounded, powerful creature allowing a stranger to feed him from her own hands, settled something anxious in her chest that she hadn't realized was still tight with fear. They stayed like that through the better part of the morning, Elena speaking softly to fill the silence, telling him small, unimportant things, because the alternative was silence heavy enough to hold the weight of everything she had lost. She told him about the stream she had found, about the way the moss grew thick over the old stones, about anything at all that was not Marcus, not the ceremony, not the pack that had turned its back on her without a second glance. The wolf listened to all of it with an attentiveness that felt almost human, his gold eyes never leaving her face, and though he could not answer her in words, Elena found herself talking anyway, the way a person might talk to the sea or to the stars, not expecting a reply but comforted all the same by the act of being heard. By midday, his breathing had steadied further, and though the wound along his ribs would clearly need more time to heal, he seemed stronger than he had the night before. Elena checked the binding she had made from her torn dress, and found the bleeding had finally stopped, the poultice of crushed yarrow doing more good than she had dared hope. "You're going to be all right," she told him, resting her hand lightly against his uninjured shoulder. "I don't know who did this to you, or where you're supposed to be, but you're going to be all right." He leaned into her touch, just slightly, and made a low sound deep in his chest that was almost, impossibly, something like gratitude. Elena did not know, could not have known, that no one had spoken to this wolf with such simple, unguarded kindness in longer than he cared to remember, not since long before he had become the kind of alpha whose enemies would try to end him in the dark. She only knew that the storm had passed, that she was alive when she had every reason not to be, and that somehow, against every rule she had been taught about caution and survival, she did not want to leave his side. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm neither Elena nor the silver wolf spoke about, because there was no need to. Each morning she woke beneath the broken slab of roof to find him already watching her, gold eyes calm in the gray light, and each morning she rose to find water and whatever food the forest offered before the sun climbed too high. By the third day, his wound had closed enough that he could stand without wincing, though he still favored the injured side when he moved. Elena had grown used to the strange comfort of his presence, the way his warmth chased off the lingering chill of the storm, the way his silence never felt empty the way silence usually did. She had told him almost everything by then, every detail of her life in the Blackthorn pack, every small humiliation that had led up to the rejection ceremony, and he had listened to all of it without judgment, without the pity she had feared. only a steady, patient attention that made her feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that her pain was actually being heard. "I used to think Marcus loved me," she said one afternoon, sitting with her back against a sun-warmed stone, while the wolf rested nearby, his great head lifted just enough to watch her. "He used to bring me flowers when we were young, before either of us understood what a mate bond even meant. I thought that meant something. I thought it meant he would choose me no matter what." The wolf's ears flattened, and a low sound rumbled in his chest, something between a growl and a sigh, as though the memory angered him on her behalf. Elena found herself smiling faintly at that, surprised by how much comfort she took from a creature who could not even speak to reassure her. "It's stupid," she continued. "He didn't even try to explain himself. He just said the words and turned away, like erasing me was the easiest thing he'd ever done. 12 years of growing up in the same pack, and that's how it ended, in front of everyone." She realized, as she said it, that this was the first time she had spoken the full truth of it aloud, without her voice breaking. Something about the wolf's quiet, unwavering attention made the words easier to say, as though speaking them to him drained some of their power to hurt her. That evening, as the sky bruised into deep purple and the first stars began to prick through the clouds, Elena noticed something she had not paid attention to before. The wolf's fur, in the fading light, seemed to hold a faint shimmer beneath its silver color, something almost metallic, catching the last of the sun, in a way ordinary fur never did. She had heard stories, old pack legends, about wolves touched by ancient bloodlines, wolves whose coats carried the mark of power, passed down through countless generations. She had always assumed they were only stories. "You're not an ordinary wolf, are you?" she said softly, watching him across the small fire she had finally managed to build using flint she'd found among the ruined stones. He met her gaze steadily, and for a moment something flickered behind his gold eyes that looked almost like hesitation, as though he wanted to answer her but could not, or would not yet. Elena did not press him further. She had learned enough about secrets and shame in the last few days to understand that everyone was entitled to their own, at their own pace. "It's all right," she said instead. "You don't have to tell me anything. I'm just grateful you're here. I don't think I would have survived that first night alone." The wolf rose then, moving carefully around the fire, and settled himself beside her, close enough that his warmth reached her, without her needing to lean into it. He rested his great head against her knee, and Elena, without quite deciding to, let her fingers sink into the thick fur behind his ears, stroking slowly, feeling the tension in his powerful frame ease beneath her touch. They stayed like that as the fire burned low, neither of them speaking, both of them, in their own separate ways, grateful for a companionship neither had expected to find in the ruins of a forgotten watchtower. It was on the fourth day that Elena first heard the sound of distant howls, faint and far off, carried on the wind from somewhere beyond the ridge. She froze instantly, every instinct sharpening, and beside her, the silver wolf rose to his feet as well, his body suddenly rigid with alertness, ears pinned forward toward the sound. "Is that your pack?" she whispered, though some part of her already suspected the answer was more complicated than a simple yes. The wolf's lips pulled back slightly, not in a snarl directed at her, but in something closer to tension, to warning. He moved to stand between her and the direction of the sound, his massive body a wall of silver fur and coiled muscle, and Elena understood, without needing words, that whoever was out there was not necessarily safe for either of them. They waited in tense silence as the howls grew closer, then, gradually, faded again, moving away along some other path through the forest. The wolf did not relax fully, even after the sound disappeared entirely, his gold eyes scanning the tree line for long minutes afterward, as though searching for a threat he expected to reappear at any moment. "Whoever attacked you," Elena said quietly, once the tension in his shoulders finally began to ease. "They're still looking for you, aren't they?" The wolf turned his head to look at her, and in his gold eyes she saw something that looked almost like an apology, as though he regretted that his danger might now extend to her as well, simply because she had chosen to stay by his side. Elena reached out and rested her hand against his flank, over the place where the wound had nearly healed. "I'm not afraid," she told him, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that it was true. "Whatever this is, whoever you really are, I'm not afraid. I already lost everything I thought mattered. I'm not running from something new just because it might be dangerous. The wolf pressed closer to her at that, his great head resting against her shoulder in a gesture that had become familiar between them over these strange, quiet days. And Elena found herself thinking, not for the first time, that whatever secret this silver-eyed stranger carried, she was no longer entirely certain she wanted to know it if it meant he might leave her once she did. That night, as she drifted toward sleep with his warmth beside her, she thought again of the howl that had called her through the storm on that first terrible night. She still could not explain why she had followed it, instead of seeking safer shelter. Why some instinct older than fear had pulled her toward danger instead of away from it. But lying there now, safe and warm against a wolf whose true nature remained a mystery, she found she could not bring herself to regret the choice, no matter what truths the coming days might force her to face. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the distant howls had belonged to search parties sent out by traders within the royal court. Wolves hunting for any trace of the Alpha King they believed they had successfully wounded beyond recovery. They would not find him, not yet. And Elena Voss, curled against the very wolf they sought in the shelter of a forgotten ruin, had no idea that the storm she had survived was only the first of many still to come. Morning brought a change in the wolf's manner that Elena noticed the moment she woke. He was pacing, slow and careful to protect his healing side, along the broken edge of the ruins, his gold eyes fixed on the horizon with an intensity she had not seen from him before. Something had shifted overnight, some decision made in the quiet hours while she slept. "You're stronger now," she observed, sitting up and pulling her knees to her chest against the morning chill. "You're thinking about leaving." The wolf stopped his pacing and turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something complicated, gratitude tangled together with reluctance, as though the thought of leaving troubled him as much as the thought of staying carried its own danger. He crossed back to her slowly and lowered himself to the ground at her side, resting his head against her lap in a gesture that felt almost like an apology offered in advance. "I understand," she said, running her hand along the ridge of fur between his ears. "Whatever is waiting for you out there, you can't hide from it forever. And I can't keep you safe the way you probably need to be kept safe. I'm just an omega with no pack." At that, the wolf lifted his head sharply, gold eyes flashing with something fierce, almost offended on her behalf, and made a low sound deep in his chest that carried unmistakable disagreement. Elena blinked, startled by the intensity of his reaction. "What?" she asked, half laughing despite herself. "It's true. I have no pack, no rank, no mate. I'm the last person who should be traveling with someone as important as you clearly are." He nudged her hand insistently with his nose, guiding her fingers back to the fur behind his ears, and the message was clear enough even without words. He did not agree with her assessment of herself, not even slightly. Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest at the gesture, a small, quiet feeling she had not expected to find again so soon after everything the ceremony had taken from her. They spent the rest of that day in careful preparation, though preparation for what, Elena could not entirely say. She gathered what supplies the forest could offer, more berries, a handful of edible roots she recognized from her mother's teachings, and enough dry wood to keep a small fire burning through the coming night. The wolf, for his part, tested his healing side with slow, careful movements, building his strength back gradually, wincing only slightly now when he shifted his weight onto the injured leg. As the sun began its slow descent that evening, painting the ruins in shades of amber and rose, Elena found herself studying the wolf's silver coat again, the strange shimmer she had noticed before catching the dying light, in a way that seemed almost deliberate, almost magical. She thought again of the old legends her grandmother used to tell around the pack fires, stories of bloodlines so old and so powerful that the wolves who carried them shone like moonlight given form. Those were just stories, she murmured to herself, though some part of her was no longer entirely convinced. The wolf's ears twitched toward her voice, and when she looked up to find his gold eyes fixed on her, she thought she saw something knowing in them, something that suggested the stories she had dismissed as childhood tales might carry more truth than she had ever imagined. But he said nothing, could say nothing, and the questions would have to wait. That night, as they settled together beneath the broken roof for what Elena sensed might be one of their last nights in this strange, quiet sanctuary, she found herself unable to sleep. She lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of the wolf's breathing, thinking about everything that had happened in the span of a single week, a rejection that had shattered her old life, a storm that had nearly killed her, and a wounded stranger who had somehow, impossibly, begun to feel like the only safe thing left in her world. "Whatever happens next," she whispered into the darkness, not entirely certain the wolf was even awake to hear her. "I'm glad I followed your howl." Beside her, in the darkness, the wolf's tail moved just slightly, a small, unmistakable gesture of understanding, and Elena finally let her eyes close, unaware that the choice she had made in that storm days ago had already changed the course of a kingdom she did not yet know existed, and that the wolf sleeping beside her carried a crown he had not worn in far too long. The morning the wolf finally shifted came without warning, though looking back, Elena would remember every small detail of it with painful clarity. She had woken early, before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, to the sound of the wolf's breathing changing beside her, growing ragged in a way that immediately pulled her fully alert. She sat up fast, fear spiking through her chest, certain for one terrible moment that his wound had somehow worsened in the night. But when she looked at him, she saw something different happening, something she had never witnessed before outside of pack ceremonies. His silver fur seemed to ripple, light catching along it in strange, shifting patterns, and his powerful frame began to contract and reshape itself with the particular violence that always accompanied a forced or difficult shift. Elena scrambled back instinctively, not from fear of him, but from the old habit of giving space to a wolf mid-change, knowing from pack experience how disorienting and painful that first return to human form could be after days spent as a wolf. The change took only a few moments, though they felt far longer, and when it finished, where the great silver wolf had lain, there was now a man. He was tall, taller than any man Elena had ever stood near, with the kind of powerfully built frame that spoke of years of hard training rather than simple size. His hair was dark, nearly black, damp with sweat from the effort of the shift, and even kneeling there in obvious pain, bracing one hand against the stone floor of the ruins, there was an unmistakable presence to him, an authority that radiated from him the way heat radiates from a fire even when the flames themselves are hidden from view. When he lifted his head and looked at her, his eyes were the same striking gold they had been as a wolf, and Elena found herself unable to look away from them even now, even with the shock of the transformation still settling over her. "You're hurt," she said, the words coming automatically, her gaze dropping to the angry red line still visible across his ribs, where her makeshift bandage had done its work. Even without fur, she could tell it was healing well, the deep gash from before now closed and scarring cleanly, though clearly it still pained him. "It's nothing now, thanks to you," he said, and his voice, when she finally heard it for the first time, was low and rough from disuse, carrying an unmistakable weight of command even in exhaustion. "I owe you a debt I don't know how to repay." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, suddenly, absurdly aware of how close they were, how little space separated them in the confines of the ruins, and how the man before her carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone used to being obeyed rather than questioned. She looked away, busying herself with pulling her cloak of torn dress fabric tighter around her shoulders, though the gesture did little to hide her sudden self-consciousness. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Anyone would have done the same." His laugh was quiet, almost surprised, as though the idea struck him as genuinely amusing. "Not many would have knelt beside a wounded stranger of my size in the middle of a storm," he said. "Fewer still would have stayed for 4 days without demanding an explanation." "I figured you'd explain when you were ready," she said simply. "Or not at all. It wasn't really my business." Something in his expression shifted at that, something almost startled, as though her answer surprised him more than he expected it to. He studied her for a long moment, gold eyes tracing over her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite herself. "My name is Cade," he said finally, offering the single word like it cost him something to give. "That's all I can tell you for now. I'm sorry. It isn't safe, not yet, for you to know more than that." "Elena," she replied, matching the simplicity of his offering with her own. "Elena Voss." Something flickered across his face when she said her surname, a flicker of recognition perhaps, or curiosity, though he said nothing about it. Instead he shifted carefully, testing his injured side, and managed to sit up more fully against the broken stone wall of the ruins, wincing only slightly at the movement. "You said Blackthorn Pack," he said after a moment. "That first night. You mentioned it. Elena's stomach tightened at the reminder. Yes, she said. Or I did. I don't think I have any claim to that name anymore. Cade's jaw tightened, something dark and controlled passing behind his gold eyes. Whoever did that to you made a grave mistake, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an edge of something that sounded almost dangerous. A pack that discards a wolf like you doesn't deserve to call itself a pack at all. Elena did not know how to respond to that, the unexpected fierceness of his defense catching her off guard, in a way that left her oddly breathless. She busied herself instead with checking the supplies she had gathered the day before, needing something to do with her hands, something to anchor her against the strange, overwhelming pull she felt toward this man, whose true name and true nature she still barely understood. They stayed in the ruins through the rest of that day, Cade resting to regain his strength, while Elena tended quietly to small tasks around their makeshift shelter. As the hours passed, she found herself stealing glances at him more often than she meant to, studying the sharp lines of his face, the careful way he moved, even in exhaustion, as though every gesture had been trained into something deliberate and controlled. He asked her, gently, more about her life, about growing up in Blackthorn territory, about the years before Marcus, about her family, and the small, ordinary joys of a childhood that felt impossibly distant now. She found herself talking more freely than she had in years. Something about his quiet, focused attention, pulling honesty out of her, the way warmth pulls sap from a tree in spring. And you? She asked eventually, turning the question back on him. What were you doing out here? Alone, injured, hiding from whoever did that to you? Cade was quiet for a long moment, weighing his answer carefully. There are people close to me, he said finally, who believe I've become inconvenient. They tried to make sure I wouldn't survive to be inconvenient any longer. Elena's breath caught. That's not an accident then. Someone you trusted did this to you. Someone I trusted enough to turn my back on, he said, and something bitter passed briefly across his face before he mastered it. It's a mistake I don't intend to make twice. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand exactly who he was, and what kind of enemies could wound a wolf of his obvious strength so severely, but something in his expression told her he had given her as much as he could for now, and she respected that the same way he had respected her own silence about the worst details of her rejection. As evening fell, Cade insisted, despite her protests, on taking the first watch, positioning himself near the entrance to the ruins, where he could see the tree line clearly. Elena settled nearby, exhaustion from the emotional weight of the day finally catching up with her, and found herself watching him in the fading light, this powerful stranger who had somehow become the strangest kind of comfort in the wreckage of her old life. You don't have to stay awake all night, she murmured sleepily. You're still healing. I'll be fine, he said, and something in his tone carried a promise beyond the simple words, a promise that whatever threat still hunted him would not be allowed anywhere near her while he still drew breath. She fell asleep to the sight of him sitting watch, silhouetted against the last light of the dying sun, and did not wake again, until deep in the night, when a distant sound, sharp and out of place among the ordinary noises of the forest, pulled her instantly alert. Cade was already on his feet, tension radiating from every line of his body, gold eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the ruins. Stay behind me, he said quietly, his voice dropping into something commanding, something that left no room for argument. Elena's heart pounded as she scrambled up, pressing herself against the broken stone wall, while Cade positioned himself protectively between her and whatever moved out there in the dark. For several long, tense minutes, nothing happened, the forest holding its breath along with them, until finally, gradually, the distant sound of movement faded away, whoever or whatever it had been passing without discovering them. Cade did not relax his guard even after the sound disappeared entirely, remaining tense and watchful for a long while afterward. When he finally turned back to check on her, something in his expression had hardened into resolve. We can't stay here much longer, he said quietly. Whoever is searching for me is getting closer, and I won't let you be caught in the middle of it if I can help it. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Where will we go? She asked. Cade's gold eyes held hers steadily in the darkness. Somewhere safer, he said. Somewhere I can figure out who to trust again, and how to reclaim what's mine, without losing anyone else along the way. Elena did not fully understand what he meant by those words, could not yet grasp the full weight of what he was choosing not to say, but something in his voice, quiet and certain, made her trust him completely, despite everything she still did not know. She nodded, and together they began, in the deep quiet of that uneasy night, to plan their departure from the only sanctuary either of them had known in days, unaware that the road ahead would reveal truths far larger than either of them had prepared for. They left the ruins just before dawn, while the forest was still cloaked in the pale gray light that comes before true morning. Cade moved carefully, his healing wound clearly still tender, though he refused every offer Elena made to slow their pace or rest longer before setting out. There was an urgency in him now that had not been there in the quieter days of his recovery, a coiled alertness that made her understand, without needing to be told, that whatever enemies hunted him were not the kind to give up easily. He led them south, away from the direction the search parties had come from days before, cutting through unfamiliar stretches of forest, with a confidence that suggested he knew this land far better than a simple traveler should. Elena followed close behind, her earlier exhaustion burned away by the sharp edge of new uncertainty, watching the trees around them with a wariness she had not felt even during her first desperate flight from Blackthorn territory. "You know this area well," she observed, as they picked their way down a steep slope thick with wet stone and tangled roots. "Better than I'd like to admit," Cade replied, his eyes scanning the tree line ahead of them constantly, never quite resting. "I spent time here once, a long time ago, before certain responsibilities made it difficult to wander freely." Elena wanted to ask what responsibilities, wanted to press further into the mystery of who exactly this man was, that he moved through hostile territory, with the calm precision of someone who had commanded far larger forces than himself. But something in the tight set of his shoulders told her the questions would have to wait, that whatever answers he owed her would come when he judged the moment safe enough to give them. By mid-morning, they had covered a considerable distance, the terrain gradually shifting from dense forest to rockier, more open ground that offered less cover, but a clearer view of anyone who might be following. Cade paused often to listen, his head tilted in a way that reminded Elena sharply of the wolf he had been only a day before, and each time he seemed satisfied that no threat had caught up to them. They continued on. It was during one of these brief pauses, resting in the shade of a large outcropping of stone, that they first encountered the rogues. There were 3 of them, lean and hard-eyed in the way that marked wolves who had spent years surviving without pack protection, emerging from the tree line with the deliberate casualness of predators who had already decided their prey could not escape. Elena tensed immediately, old fears about rogue wolves rising sharp in her memory, tales every pup was taught about the dangers waiting for anyone caught alone in unclaimed territory. Cade, however, did not tense the way she expected. Instead, he simply straightened, the exhaustion and careful movement of the past few days falling away from him like a discarded cloak, replaced by something commanding, something that radiated authority so completely that Elena felt it like a physical pressure in the air around them. The lead rogue, a scarred man with pale eyes, took one look at Cade and stopped dead in his tracks, his expression shifting rapidly from predatory confidence to something that looked, unmistakably, like recognition mixed with fear. The other 2, who had been fanning out to flank them, froze as well, exchanging uncertain glances. "We don't want trouble," the lead rogue said, his voice carrying a rasp of nervousness that had not been there in his initial approach. "We didn't realize." Cade's expression did not change, but something in his stance shifted further, an unmistakable projection of dominance that made even Elena, who had no history with these men, feel the instinct to lower her gaze. "Then leave," Cade said simply, his voice quiet but carrying an authority that needed no volume to enforce itself. "And forget you saw anything here." The 3 rogues did not argue. They melted back into the tree line with a speed that bordered on desperate, and within moments, the small clearing was empty again, except for Elena and Cade, the tension of the confrontation still hanging thick in the air between them. Elena stared at him, questions crowding her throat faster than she could organize them into words. "They knew you," she finally managed. "They recognized you on sight, and they were terrified." Cade's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might deflect again, retreat back into the careful vagueness he had maintained since his first shift. Instead, he let out a slow breath, something in his posture softening slightly, as though he had decided, in that moment, that she deserved more honesty than he had given her so far. There are things about who I am that I haven't told you, he said quietly. Not because I don't trust you. Because the truth puts you in more danger than you already are, simply by being near me. I've been trying to decide how to explain it without frightening you away. Elena felt her heart pound, uncertainty, and something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope, tangling together in her chest. I followed a stranger's howl through a storm, and stayed by his side through 4 days of not knowing anything about him, she said. I don't think I frighten easily anymore, Cade. Whatever it is, I'd rather hear it from you than keep guessing. Something in his gold eyes softened at that, an expression that looked almost like gratitude, almost like relief, though beneath it, she could still see the weight of whatever burden he carried, heavy and unresolved. Soon, he promised. I need to be certain we're not being followed before I tell you everything. I owe you that much certainty at least, before I ask you to carry the weight of what I am. Elena nodded, though the uncertainty lingered, curling uneasily in her stomach as they resumed their journey southward. She thought of the rogue's fear, the instant, involuntary deference in their postures, the moment they had recognized Cade, and found herself piecing together fragments of an answer that felt too large, too impossible to fully accept yet. They walked in comfortable silence for a while after that, the earlier tension gradually easing as the terrain grew more familiar, small signs of civilization beginning to appear at the edges of the forest, worn footpaths, the distant sound of a river, the faint scent of wood smoke carried on the wind from somewhere beyond the trees. We're close to a town, Cade said eventually, noting her attention to these small details. Small, mostly human, with only a handful of wolves living quietly among them. It should be safe enough to rest there for a night, gather supplies, before we continue. Elena nodded, grateful at the prospect of a proper meal, and perhaps even a real bed, luxuries she had not allowed herself to think about during the strange, suspended days in the ruins. As they continued walking, she found herself watching Cade more closely, noticing the way even his careful, measured stride carried an unmistakable quality of command, the way his eyes swept their surroundings with the practiced vigilance of someone used to protecting far more than just himself. Whoever you are, she thought, studying the sharp, handsome lines of his profile in the afternoon light, you're not just some wolf who happened to cross my path in a storm. She did not say the thought aloud, choosing instead to let the mystery unfold at whatever pace he needed, trusting, despite everything she still did not understand, that the truth, when it finally came, would not change the strange, undeniable pull she felt toward him. What she could not have known yet was how completely that truth would upend everything she thought she understood about her own place in the world, and how soon the answers she sought would arrive. The town, when they finally reached it as the sun began its slow slide toward the horizon, was smaller than Elena had expected, a scattering of stone and timber buildings clustered along a single winding street, with smoke curling lazily from chimneys, and the ordinary sounds of evening settling over the place like a blanket. It was, as Cade had promised, mostly human, though Elena caught the faint, unmistakable scent of a few wolves living quietly among the townsfolk, blended so seamlessly into daily life that no outsider would have guessed their nature. Cade kept his hood drawn low as they walked the main street, an old traveling cloak he had procured from somewhere during their journey that Elena had not thought to ask about. His posture, too, had changed subtly, the commanding bearing that had frightened the rogues folded away beneath something more ordinary, more forgettable, the careful disguise of a man who had clearly practiced moving unnoticed through the world when necessary. They found a small inn near the edge of town, its sign faded, but its windows glowing warm with candlelight, and Cade paid for a room using coin Elena had not seen him carrying, another small mystery she filed away among the growing collection she had accumulated since the storm. The innkeeper, an older woman with sharp eyes that missed little, studied them both for a moment longer than Elena was entirely comfortable with, before handing over a key without comment. The room itself was simple but clean, a stark contrast to the cold stone of the ruins they had left behind, and Elena felt something in her chest loosen at the sight of an actual bed, a small hearth already laid with wood, and a wash basin filled with clean water. She realized, standing there, just how much the past several days had worn on her, not just physically, but in ways deeper and harder to name. "You should rest," Cade said, watching her with an expression that carried more warmth than she had seen from him since his shift. "I'll arrange for food to be brought up. You've more than earned a proper meal." Elena wanted to argue, some old habit of stubborn self-reliance rising automatically, but exhaustion won out, and she found herself sinking gratefully onto the edge of the bed while Cade slipped back out to speak with the innkeeper. Alone for the first time in days, she allowed herself a moment of genuine reflection, turning over everything that had happened since the ceremony, the rejection, the storm, the howl, the wolf who had become, impossibly, the safest presence in her upended world. She thought of Marcus, and found, to her own surprise, that the thought no longer carried the same raw, devastating pain it had only a week ago. It still hurt, the humiliation and the loss of everything she had once believed about her own life, but somehow, sitting in this small, warm room with the scent of Cade still lingering faintly in the air around her, the pain felt smaller, more distant, as though it belonged to a different version of herself entirely. When Cade returned a short while later, carrying a tray laden with simple but hearty food, bread still warm from the oven, a rich stew, and a small pitcher of something that smelled faintly of honeyed wine, Elena felt a rush of gratitude so sudden and complete that it startled her. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning far more than just the meal. Cade's gold eyes softened as he set the tray down between them, settling onto the small chair near the hearth rather than the bed, a small courtesy she noticed and appreciated. "You don't need to thank me for something so small," he said. "Not after everything you've already given me." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the warmth of the food and the crackling fire slowly easing the last of the day's tension from Elena's shoulders. It was only once the meal was finished, the tray pushed aside, and the room settling into a quiet, intimate stillness, that Cade finally spoke again, his voice carrying a weight that told her the moment for answers had finally arrived. "I think it's time I told you everything," he said. Elena's heart began to pound, though she kept her expression steady, some instinct telling her that whatever came next deserved her full, calm attention rather than visible nervousness. "All right," she said simply. Cade was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts, his gold eyes fixed on the fire rather than on her, as though the flames made the confession easier to voice. "My full name is Cade Ashwood," he began. "I hold a position of significant authority among the northern packs, one that comes with responsibilities I've spent most of my life training to carry." Elena waited, sensing there was more, far more, beneath the careful, measured way he was choosing his words. "Several weeks ago," he continued, "there was an attempt made on my life by people close to my own court, people I had trusted with my safety, and the safety of everyone under my protection. I survived the initial attack, but I was severely injured, and I made the decision to disappear rather than return immediately, both to heal and to determine exactly who among my advisors could still be trusted. That decision led me into the storm the night you found me." Elena absorbed this slowly, pieces of the past several days rearranging themselves in her mind with new clarity. The rogue's instant fear, the unnatural size and strength of his wolf form, the shimmer in his silver coat that had reminded her of old legends she had dismissed as childhood stories. "Authority among the northern packs," she repeated carefully. "How much authority, exactly?" Cade finally turned to look at her fully, and something in his gold eyes carried an unmistakable gravity, an honesty that held no more room for careful evasion. "I'm not simply an alpha of one pack, Elena," he said quietly. "I hold the title of Alpha King. Every pack in the Northern Territories, including Blackthorn, answers to my authority." The room seemed to tilt slightly around her, the weight of his words settling over Elena with a force that stole the breath from her lungs. She stared at him, searching his face for some sign that she had misunderstood, but there was only quiet, steady honesty looking back at her, along with something else, something that looked almost like fear of her reaction. "You're the Alpha King," she repeated slowly, the words feeling strange and enormous in her mouth. "The wolf I found in the ruins, the wolf I bandaged with my own dress, the wolf I fed berries to with my bare hands." A faint, almost apologetic smile touched the corner of Cade's mouth. "That would be me, yes." Elena felt a dozen different emotions crash through her at once. Disbelief, embarrassment at the casual, unguarded way she had spoken to him during those first days, and beneath all of it, a slow, dawning realization of exactly how much danger he had placed himself in simply by staying hidden with her, rather than immediately seeking the protection his position surely afforded him. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, though the question carried no real anger, only genuine confusion. Because the moment you know who I truly am, he said, his voice quieter now, more careful, everything changes between us. I wanted, selfishly perhaps, a little more time where you saw me simply as Cade, before you saw me as a title, a position, a source of danger and complication in your life. I know that wasn't entirely fair to you. I'm sorry for that. Elena studied him for a long moment, turning his words over, weighing the strange tenderness of his confession against the enormity of what it meant. You're not what I expected an alpha king to be, she said finally, some of the tension in the room easing at the honesty in her own voice. I always imagined someone like that would be cold, distant, not someone who'd let a stranger bandage his wounds with her own dress and fall asleep pressed against her for warmth. Something in Cade's expression shifted at that, something that looked, unmistakably, like relief, as though her response had lifted a weight he had been carrying since the moment his identity crossed his mind, as a secret worth keeping. Perhaps I'm not entirely what an alpha king is supposed to be, he admitted. Perhaps that's part of why my enemies believed they could move against me so easily. Elena felt a flare of protective anger on his behalf, sharp and immediate, surprising in its intensity. Whoever did this to you, she said, they're the ones who made the mistake. Not you. Cade's gold eyes held hers steadily across the small distance between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet of the room thick with everything that had just been said, and everything that still remained unspoken between them. Elena thought, not for the first time, of the strange, undeniable pull she had felt the moment she first heard his howl through the storm, a pull that made even less sense now than it had before, and yet somehow felt more significant than ever. There's something else, Cade said finally, his voice dropping lower, carrying a new kind of hesitation that felt different from his earlier caution. Something I haven't told you yet, and I don't know how you'll receive it. Elena's heart began to pound again, though this time the sensation carried less fear and more anticipation, some instinct telling her that whatever came next would matter more than anything he had told her so far. Tell me, she said simply. Cade held her gaze for a long moment, gathering the kind of courage that even an alpha king, it seemed, needed to face certain truths, and Elena waited, breathless, on the edge of understanding something that would change the shape of everything that came after. When I heard your voice that first night, calling to me through the storm before you even found the ruins, Cade said slowly, choosing each word with obvious care, something happened inside me that I still don't fully understand. My wolf recognized something in you, something I've felt only in old stories told to pups before sleep, stories about bonds that choose themselves regardless of pack, rank, or circumstance. Elena's breath caught, understanding beginning to form at the edges of her mind, though she was not yet ready to name it fully. What are you saying? She asked quietly. I'm saying that before that storm, I had already begun to feel a pull toward something, someone, I hadn't yet found, Cade continued, a sense of searching that I couldn't explain, one that had been growing stronger for weeks before the attack against me. When I heard your voice, that pull became undeniable. I don't fully understand the mechanics of it, not yet, but I believe, Elena, that what drew us together in that storm was more than simple chance. Elena sat very still, the weight of his words settling over her slowly, like snow accumulating in silence. She thought of the strange, instinctive pull she had felt following his howl through the storm, the way her wolf had lifted its head for the first time since the rejection ceremony, the deep, inexplicable sense of recognition that had guided her steps when every rational instinct told her to seek shelter instead. She had told herself it was desperation, grief, the simple human need to follow any sound that promised she was not entirely alone in the dark. Now, hearing Cade voice something so similar to what she herself had felt, she was no longer certain that explanation had ever been the true one. I don't know what to say to that, she admitted honestly. I felt something too that night. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that I was just scared and looking for anything to follow that wasn't my own thoughts. Cade's expression softened further, something achingly gentle passing across his features. I'm not asking you to accept anything you're not ready for, he said. I only wanted you to have the truth, all of it, before we go any further together. Whatever this is between us, I won't pretend it doesn't exist simply because the timing is complicated, or because you've only just survived a rejection that would have broken most wolves entirely. Elena felt tears rise unexpectedly, not from sadness this time, but from something far more complicated, the strange, disorienting relief of being seen so completely, so soon after being discarded so thoroughly. I don't know if I'm ready to trust something like that again, she admitted quietly. Not after Marcus. I understand, Cade said, and the sincerity in his voice left no room to doubt him. I'm not asking for anything tonight beyond honesty. Whatever comes next between us, we can take at whatever pace you need. I've waited this long to find whatever this is. I can wait longer, if that's what you require. Elena studied him for a long moment, this man who held more power than she could fully comprehend, who had chosen vulnerability and patience over demand or expectation, and felt something in her chest settle, quietly, into a decision she had not consciously realized she was making. Thank you, she said softly, for telling me, for not making me guess, or find out some other way. Cade reached out then, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and rested his hand gently over hers where it lay on the small table between them. His touch was warm, careful, carrying none of the presumption she might have expected from someone of his position, only quiet, patient warmth. Get some rest, he said softly. Tomorrow we'll figure out the next steps together. But tonight, you don't have to carry any of this alone. Elena let her fingers curl slightly against his, a small, tentative acceptance of the warmth he offered, and felt, for the first time since the ceremony had shattered her old life, something that felt dangerously, wonderfully close to hope, beginning to take root in the wreckage of everything she had lost. Elena woke the next morning to sunlight streaming through the small window of the inn room, warmer and more golden than any morning she had known in the ruins, and for a moment, disoriented by the softness of the bed beneath her, she forgot entirely where she was. Then memory returned in a rush, the confession of the night before, the truth of who Cade really was, the strange, tentative warmth that had passed between them, and she sat up quickly, searching the room for him. He was seated near the window, already dressed, his posture alert in a way that told her he had likely been awake for hours, watching the street below through a careful gap in the curtains. When he noticed she was awake, his expression softened immediately, the sharp vigilance easing into something warmer. Good morning, he said. I hope you slept well. Better than I have in longer than I want to admit, she admitted, pushing herself upright and running a hand through her still tangled hair. What's happening out there? Cade's jaw tightened slightly. Nothing good, he said. I sent word last night, carefully, to someone I still trust completely, an old friend who serves as one of my personal guard. He should arrive by midday with news of the court, and hopefully, confirmation of exactly who among my advisors orchestrated the attack against me. Elena felt a fresh wave of nervousness at that, the reminder that whatever gentle, quiet intimacy had grown between them existed within the much larger, more dangerous context of Cade's true position. Is it safe, having him come here? She asked. What if he's followed? I trust him with my life, Cade said simply. He's proven that trust more than once. But you're right to be cautious. We'll need to be ready to move quickly, regardless of what news he brings. They spent the morning in careful preparation, Cade instructing Elena on small details that might matter should they need to flee again, routes out of the town, signs of danger to watch for, the particular way certain wolves carried themselves when they meant harm, versus when they simply passed through as travelers. Elena absorbed all of it with the quiet, focused attention of someone who understood, now more than ever, that her survival and Cade's were becoming increasingly intertwined. It was nearing midday when a sharp knock sounded at the door, 3 quick raps followed by a pause, and then 2 more, a pattern that Elena guessed, correctly, was some kind of signal. Cade rose immediately, tension coiling through his frame, and crossed to the door, opening it only after confirming through the small gap who stood on the other side. The man who entered was broad-shouldered and weathered, with the kind of scarred, capable look of someone who had spent years in service to something larger than himself. His eyes found Cade first, relief and something like fierce loyalty passing visibly across his face, before flicking briefly to Elena with obvious curiosity. Your Grace, he said, dropping his voice low despite the closed door. Thank the moon you're alive. We feared the worst when you didn't return. I'm harder to kill than that, Cade said, though something grim passed behind his eyes. What have you learned, Garrick? The man, Garrick, glanced once more at Elena before continuing, and Cade, noticing the hesitation, spoke again with quiet firmness. She stays. Whatever you have to say, she can hear it. Garrick nodded, accepting this without further question, and pulled a folded piece of parchment from within his coat. It's confirmed, he said grimly. Lord Halric orchestrated the attack, working with at least 3 others within the court, possibly more we haven't identified yet. They've been telling the Pax you were killed, that Halric is stepping in as regent until a new alpha can be properly selected. Cade's expression darkened considerably, a coldness settling over his features that Elena had not seen from him before, something that spoke unmistakably of the authority and danger he carried beneath the gentle exterior she had come to know. Halric, he repeated, the name carrying weight and betrayal in equal measure. I trusted that man with the safety of half my territory. He's moving quickly to consolidate support, Garrick continued. If we don't return soon with proof of your survival, he may succeed in claiming enough loyalty among the pack leaders to make challenging him significantly more difficult, even with your rightful claim intact. Elena watched the exchange with growing unease, understanding now the true scale of danger surrounding Cade, a danger that extended far beyond simple assassination into something closer to a coup, an entire kingdom's stability hanging in the balance. She thought of Blackthorn, wondering distantly whether her own former pack had already heard the false news of Cade's death, whether Marcus and the others were even now debating loyalty to a usurper. How long until we can safely return? Cade asked. Garrick's expression turned careful. That depends on how visible you're willing to be, Your Grace. If you return openly, proving you're alive, it forces Halric's hand immediately, but it also puts you at significant risk, should he have loyalists positioned close enough to make another attempt. Cade was quiet for a long moment, weighing the options with the visible weight of someone accustomed to decisions that affected far more than his own safety. Then, slowly, he turned to look at Elena, something searching in his gold eyes. This changes things for you as well, he said quietly. If I return to reclaim my position, you'll be drawn into all of it, the danger, the political complications, everything I was trying to protect you from by staying hidden this long. Elena held his gaze steadily, surprised by how little hesitation she felt in her answer. I already told you, she said. I'm not running from something just because it's dangerous. I followed your Howl through a storm that could have killed me. I'm not turning back now. Something in Cade's expression shifted at that, an emotion too complex to name fully, gratitude and fierce protectiveness, and something warmer still, all tangled together in the steady weight of his gaze. Garrick, watching the exchange with poorly concealed interest, cleared his throat diplomatically. If I may, Your Grace, he said carefully, the pack leaders will need to see proof not just of your survival, but of your continued strength, your fitness to lead. A wolf who returns wounded and hunted may find some leaders hesitant to commit fully, especially those already tempted by Halric's promises. Cade's jaw tightened, but he nodded, accepting the practical truth of the assessment. Then we move carefully, he said. We gather proof of Halric's betrayal, enough to leave no room for pack leaders to hesitate in their loyalty, and we return with strength, not desperation. The rest of the day passed in tense planning, Garrick providing details about which pack leaders remained likely loyal, which had already begun shifting their support toward Halric, and which remained genuinely uncertain, their loyalty still available to be won, with the right combination of proof and presence. Elena listened to all of it with growing understanding of the enormous complexity Cade navigated daily, a burden of leadership that made her earlier assumptions about cold, distant authority seem almost laughably simplistic. As evening approached and Garrick departed to begin gathering the evidence they would need, promising to return within 2 days with whatever proof he could secure, Elena found herself alone with Cade again, the small room feeling different now, weighted with the reality of everything ahead of them. You didn't have to let me stay for that conversation, she said quietly, once the door had closed behind Garrick. Most people in your position would have sent me away to protect whatever secrecy the situation required. Cade turned to look at her, something soft and certain in his expression. I don't want to build whatever this is between us on secrets, he said. Not after everything we've already shared. If you're going to stand beside me through what's coming, you deserve to understand exactly what that means, the danger as much as anything else. Elena crossed the room slowly, closing the distance between them, driven by an instinct she no longer felt the need to question or resist. I meant what I said, she told him softly. I'm not afraid of what's coming. I'm more afraid of going back to a life where I pretend rejection didn't teach me anything about what actually matters. Cade's hand rose, gentle and questioning, to rest against her cheek, and Elena leaned into the touch without hesitation, something settling deep and certain in her chest, at the simple warmth of it. "And what does matter?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like wonder. Elena considered the question seriously, thinking of everything the past week had taught her, the storm, the ruins, the slow, careful trust that had built between them, without demand or expectation. "Being seen," she said finally, "being chosen, not out of obligation or convenience, but because someone actually wants to stand beside you, dangers and all." Cade's gold eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a certainty that reached all the way down into her bones. "Then let me be clear about my choice, Elena Voss," he said quietly. "Whatever comes in the days ahead, whatever dangers or complications, I choose you. Not out of some strange pull neither of us fully understands yet, though I won't deny that exists. I choose you because in 4 days spent broken and hunted, you were the only person who saw me simply as someone worth saving, without knowing or caring what title I carried." Tears rose unexpectedly in Elena's eyes, and she found she had no words adequate to answer him, only the overwhelming quiet certainty that whatever came next, she no longer faced it as the discarded, forgotten Omega Marcus had left behind in front of the entire pack. She was something else now, someone else, forged in storm and ruin and the slow, patient warmth of a king who had chosen her before either of them fully understood what that choice would cost, or demand of them both. Outside, the town settled into evening quiet, unaware that within its walls, the fate of an entire kingdom was beginning to take shape around a bond neither storm nor betrayal had managed to break. Sleep came easier that night than Elena expected, curled beneath warm blankets with Cade seated near enough that his presence alone seemed to chase away the last of her lingering unease. But it was not to last uninterrupted. Deep in the night, a soft, deliberate sound at the window pulled her sharply from sleep, her wolf instincts recognizing danger before her conscious mind fully caught up. Cade was already moving, silent and fast, despite his healing wound, positioning himself between Elena and the window in the space of a single breath. "Stay down," he murmured, his voice dropping into the low, commanding register she had heard only once before, during the confrontation with the rogues. Through the gap in the curtains, a shadow shifted, deliberate and careful, the unmistakable silhouette of someone attempting to move unseen along the narrow ledge outside their window. Elena's heart pounded as she pressed herself low against the wall, watching Cade's coiled readiness with a mixture of fear and fierce trust. The shadow paused directly outside the glass, and for one suspended moment, nothing happened, the whole room holding its breath. Then, with startling speed, Cade lunged, wrenching the window open and seizing the intruder by the collar before they could react, hauling them bodily into the room with a controlled violence that spoke of extensive training. The man who tumbled onto the floor was young, lean, dressed in dark traveling clothes that marked him as no ordinary thief. He scrambled backward, eyes wide with fear as Cade loomed over him, gold eyes blazing with barely contained fury. "Who sent you?" Cade demanded, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to physically press the intruder flat against the floorboards. The man's mouth worked silently for a moment before words finally came, tumbling out in a rush of panic. "Lord Halrich's men," he stammered. "They're offering coin to anyone who can confirm sightings of you. I wasn't sent to harm you, I swear it, only to watch, to report back if I found anything." Cade's expression darkened further, though he did not tighten his grip beyond what was necessary to keep the man still. "How many others are searching?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I don't know exactly," the man admitted, voice cracking with fear. "A dozen, perhaps more, spread across every town within 3 days' travel of the ruins, where you were last seen fighting. Halrich wants proof of your death, or your continued life, before he moves any further with the pack leaders." Elena watched the exchange with her heart still hammering, understanding now with visceral clarity just how close and immediate the danger surrounding Cade truly was, how thin the margin had been between safety and discovery, even within the quiet walls of this small inn. Cade questioned the man further, extracting details about Halrich's methods, the specific towns being watched, the names of a few other agents operating in the region, before finally releasing him with a warning so cold and absolute that the man fled through the window the moment he was freed, not once looking back. Once he was gone, Cade closed and secured the window carefully, his expression grim as he turned back to Elena, who had not moved from her position against the wall. "Are you all right?" he asked immediately, crossing to kneel beside her, concern overriding the lingering tension of the confrontation. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "That was close." "Too close," Cade agreed, his jaw tight. "We can't stay here another night. Halrick's reach is wider than I hoped, and if his agents are watching every town this close to the ruins, it's only a matter of time before someone recognizes me despite my care." Elena nodded, understanding the necessity, even as exhaustion and fear tangled together in her chest. "What about Garrick?" she asked. "He said 2 days." "We'll send word for him to meet us elsewhere," Cade said, already moving to gather what few belongings they had accumulated. "There's a village further south, smaller, less likely to be watched. It should give us the safety we need to regroup properly." They left before dawn, slipping out of the inn through a rear passage Cade seemed to know instinctively, moving quickly and quietly through streets still mostly empty of early risers. Elena kept close to his side, adrenaline sharpening her senses despite the lingering exhaustion of the disrupted night, watching every shadow with new, hard-won wariness. As they cleared the edge of town and struck out once more into open countryside, the sun beginning its slow climb over the horizon behind them, Elena found herself thinking of how much had changed in the span of little more than a week. She was no longer simply the rejected Omega fleeing blindly into a storm. She had become, without quite realizing the transformation as it happened, someone capable of standing steady in the face of real danger. Someone whose presence Cade had chosen to protect, not out of obligation, but out of a bond neither of them fully understood yet. "Whatever waits for us," she thought, glancing at Cade's determined profile beside her as they walked, "I'm not facing it as someone easily discarded anymore." The road ahead stretched long and uncertain toward the village Cade had named, and beyond it, toward a reckoning with a kingdom's worth of betrayal that neither of them could yet fully anticipate. But for the first time since the ceremony that had shattered her old life, Elena Voss walked forward not in flight, but in purpose, and that distinction, small as it seemed, made all the difference in the world. The village Cade led them to sat nestled in a shallow valley, smaller even than the town they had left behind, little more than a cluster of farmhouses and a single modest inn surrounding a well-worn crossroads. It took them the better part of the day to reach it, traveling carefully along less obvious paths, avoiding the main roads where Halrick's agents were most likely to watch for travelers matching their description. By the time they arrived, exhaustion had settled deep into Elena's bones, though she said nothing of it, matching Cade's steady pace without complaint. He noticed anyway, the way he seemed to notice most things about her now, and slowed enough to let her catch her breath as they approached the edge of the village. "We'll rest here properly," he said, his voice gentle despite the tension still visible in his shoulders. "Garrick knows to look for us in villages matching this description. If our original plans change, he'll find us." They found lodging with a farming family on the village outskirts, a quiet, unassuming arrangement that drew far less attention than an inn might have. The family, an older couple with grown children long since moved away, asked no questions beyond the practical, accepting Cade's coin and Elena's polite gratitude without curiosity about who they were, or why they traveled so carefully. That evening, settled in the modest guest room the couple provided, Elena found herself studying Cade across the small space, noting the way exhaustion had finally begun to show through his careful composure, the tightness around his eyes that spoke of a burden far heavier than simple physical tiredness. "You're carrying all of this alone," she observed quietly. "The danger, the betrayal, the responsibility for an entire kingdom. Even with Garrick's help, even with me here, you're still carrying most of it by yourself." Cade's expression flickered with something surprised, as though the observation had caught him off guard. "It's not something I know how to share," he admitted after a moment. "Leadership like mine was never meant to be a burden shared equally. I was raised to carry it alone, to make it look effortless, even when it wasn't." "That sounds lonely," Elena said softly. Something in Cade's gold eyes shifted at that, a vulnerability she had glimpsed only rarely since his identity had been revealed. "It was," he admitted, "before the storm, before you." Elena felt her heart ache at the simple honesty of that admission, understanding now, more fully than before, just how much isolation came paired with the power and authority he carried. She crossed the small room and settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, offering the same quiet comfort she had given him during those first strange days in the ruins, before either of them had known the true shape of what they carried toward each other. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," she said simply. "Not the parts you're willing to share, anyway." Cade turned to look at her, something achingly grateful in his expression, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unspoken between them settling into something that felt, despite all the danger surrounding them, remarkably peaceful. 2 days passed in careful, watchful quiet, Elena and Cade settling into the rhythms of the farming village, helping with small chores to maintain their disguise as ordinary travelers, while Cade watched constantly for any sign of Garrick's return, or, more worryingly, any indication that Halrick's agents had tracked them this far south. Elena found unexpected comfort in the simple, ordinary tasks, gathering eggs, helping prepare meals, activities so far removed from the drama of pack politics and royal betrayal, that they offered a strange, grounding relief. It was on the third evening, as the sun began its slow descent behind the surrounding hills, that Garrick finally arrived, dust-covered and travel-worn, but carrying an expression of grim satisfaction that told Elena, even before he spoke, that he had found what they needed. "I have it," he said without preamble, once he had been shown into their small guest room and the door secured behind him. Proof of Halrick's involvement. Direct correspondence between him and 2 of the pack leaders he's been courting, promising them territory and favor in exchange for their loyalty once he claims the regency. Cade's expression hardened as he took the offered documents, scanning them quickly, his jaw tightening further with each line he read. "This is more than enough," he said finally, his voice carrying a cold, controlled fury that made Elena's skin prickle with sympathetic anger on his behalf. "Halrick has committed treason in writing. No pack leader with any honor will be able to deny this once it's presented properly." Garrick nodded, though his expression remained cautious. "There's more you should know," he said. "Halrick has grown bold in his belief that you're truly gone. He's called a gathering of the pack leaders in 5 days' time, at the royal seat, to formally propose his regency. If we're going to stop this before it becomes irreversible, we need to move quickly." Cade was quiet for a long moment, calculating, before he finally spoke. "Then we move toward the royal seat," he said, carefully, but without further delay. "Elena, Garrick, both of you should know, once we're within a day's travel of the seat, the danger increases significantly. Halrick will have loyalists watching every approach." Elena felt a fresh wave of nervousness at that, though it settled quickly beneath the same steady resolve that had carried her through every challenge since the storm. "I'm not turning back now," she said firmly. "Whatever the danger, I told you already, I'm staying beside you through this." Garrick glanced between them, with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand more about the nature of their bond than either of them had explicitly explained, though he said nothing about it directly, simply nodding in acceptance of the plan taking shape. "We leave at first light," Cade said, his tone shifting into something more decisive, more clearly the voice of a king reclaiming his authority with each passing moment. "Garrick, gather whatever additional evidence you can along the way. Elena and I will need every advantage we can secure before we face Halrick directly." As Garrick departed to make preparations, Elena found herself alone with Cade once more, the weight of what lay ahead settling heavily over the small room. She studied his face in the dim evening light, noting the way resolve had hardened his features into something that looked, more than ever before, like the king he truly was. "You're different now," she observed quietly. "Since Garrick arrived, something's changed." Cade's gold eyes found hers, and though the hardness remained, something warmer flickered beneath it when he looked at her. "I have to be," he said. "In 5 days, I face the men who tried to end my life and steal everything I was born to protect. I can't do that, as the wounded stranger you found in the ruins. I have to do it as their king." Elena nodded, understanding the necessity even as something in her ached at the reminder of how much distance still separated her ordinary, discarded life from the extraordinary reality he inhabited. "Then let me help you become that king again," she said softly, "whatever that requires of me." Cade's expression softened at that, and he reached for her hand, holding it with a gentleness that contradicted the hardening resolve in every other line of his body. "Just being beside me is more help than you know," he said quietly. "Whatever happens at the royal seat, I want you there. Not hidden away for safety, but beside me, where you belong." Elena felt the weight and significance of that request settle over her, understanding that standing beside an Alpha King at his moment of greatest political danger meant far more than simple companionship. It meant being seen, publicly, as someone he had chosen, someone whose place beside him he intended to make undeniable to every pack leader who might otherwise question it. "I'll be there," she promised, and meant it with a certainty that surprised even herself. Outside, the last light of evening faded into full dark, and somewhere beyond the quiet hills surrounding the village, at the royal seat where treachery had taken root in Cade's absence, preparations for a very different kind of reckoning were already beginning to unfold. They set out before the sun had fully cleared the hills, the farming couple bidding them a simple, unquestioning farewell that carried more warmth than Elena had expected from strangers who knew nothing of who they truly were. The road toward the royal seat wound through increasingly unfamiliar territory, the landscape shifting gradually from quiet farmland into something grander, more populated, small villages growing closer together the further they traveled, until finally, the towers of the royal seat itself became visible on the horizon, pale stone catching the morning light. Elena had never seen anything like it. The Blackthorn Pack's territory had boasted nothing more grand than a large lodge at its center, but the royal seat rose from the landscape like something out of the old stories her grandmother used to tell, walls of pale stone climbing toward towers that seemed to touch the clouds themselves, banners bearing a silver wolf crest snapping in the wind, despite what she now knew was a kingdom in crisis. "That's where you belong," she said quietly, studying the distant towers with something between awe and apprehension. Cade's expression, beside her, carried a complicated mixture of determination and something that looked almost like grief. "It's where I was born," he said, "where my father ruled before me, and his father before him. I never imagined returning to it like this, forced to prove my own survival to men who should have never doubted my authority in the first place." Garrick, walking a short distance ahead to scout the road for any sign of danger, called back a quiet warning as they approached a fork in the path. "There's a checkpoint ahead," he said. "Halrick's men, likely watching for exactly the kind of travelers we appear to be." Cade's jaw tightened, calculation passing quickly behind his gold eyes. "We'll go around," he decided. "There's an older path, less traveled, that skirts the checkpoint through the eastern woods. It adds time, but it keeps us unseen until we're ready to be seen." They diverted from the main road, cutting through dense woodland that grew increasingly familiar to Cade with every step, old memories clearly surfacing as he navigated paths Elena suspected he had not walked since childhood. The detour cost them the better part of a day, but by evening, they had circled around the checkpoint entirely, emerging onto a quieter approach to the royal seat that Garrick confirmed was far less likely to be watched. As they made camp for what would be their final night before reaching the royal seat, tension hummed through all three of them, the weight of the coming confrontation settling heavier with each passing hour. Elena found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, watching the small fire Garrick had built with careful discretion, thinking of everything that waited for them beyond the final stretch of road ahead. Cade found her still awake well past midnight, settling beside her near the fire with the quiet, careful movements that had become familiar over the past days. "Nervous?" he asked gently. "Terrified," she admitted honestly. "Not for myself. For you. Halrick has had weeks to consolidate support. What if the proof isn't enough? What if the pack leaders don't believe it, or don't care?" Cade was quiet for a moment, considering the fear seriously rather than dismissing it. "Then we fight for it," he said finally. "Not with claws and blood, not unless it comes to that, but with truth, presented clearly and without hesitation. I've spent my whole life learning how to lead these people. I have to trust that leadership means something, even now, even against betrayal this deep." Elena studied his profile in the firelight, the resolve etched into every line of his face, and felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest, a certainty that whatever came next, she would stand beside him through all of it, whatever the cost. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, I need you to know that finding you in that storm was the best thing that's happened to me in longer than I can remember, no matter how this ends." Cade turned to look at her fully then, firelight catching the gold of his eyes, and something passed between them in that quiet moment that needed no further words to explain, a certainty deeper than the danger surrounding them, deeper than politics or betrayal, or the uncertain days still ahead. "Get some rest," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion he did not fully voice. "Tomorrow, we reclaim everything Halric tried to steal." Elena nodded, and though sleep did not come easily, she found comfort in his steady presence beside her through the remaining hours of darkness, both of them silently preparing for a dawn that would determine far more than either of their individual fates. Dawn broke gray and cold over the final approach to the royal seat, and Elena felt the shift in Cade the moment the towers came fully into view, a hardening of his posture, a coldness settling over his features that transformed him, gradually, into someone she barely recognized from the gentle, patient man who had shared quiet stories with her in the ruins. "This is the version of you they'll see today, isn't it?" she observed quietly as they walked. "The king, not the man." Cade's gold eyes flickered toward her briefly. "It has to be," he said. "Halric and anyone who supported him need to see strength today, not vulnerability. But Elena, understand this. The man from the ruins isn't gone. He's simply learned, over many years, when he can afford to be seen and when he cannot." They reached the outer gates of the royal seat by mid-morning, and Elena watched, heart pounding, as the guards stationed there caught sight of Cade approaching, and froze in unmistakable shock, several immediately dropping to one knee, despite the dust and travel wear that marked all three of them after days on the road. "Your Grace," one of the guards said, disbelief and relief warring openly in his voice. "We were told you were dead." "I assure you," Cade said, his voice carrying the full weight of command Elena had glimpsed, only in fragments until now. "The rumors of my death were premature, and deliberately manufactured by those who wish to profit from them. Send word immediately that I require the full council of pack leaders assembled within the hour, Lord Halric included." The guard scrambled to obey, and word of Cade's return seemed to spread through the royal seat like wildfire, servants and guards alike pausing in open astonishment as they passed, several dropping into hasty bows, others simply staring, as though unable to fully process what they were seeing. Elena stayed close to Cade's side throughout, acutely aware of the curious, assessing glances that followed her as well, servants and nobles alike clearly trying to understand her presence beside their returned king. They made their way through halls of pale stone and towering ceilings, grander than anything Elena had ever imagined, tapestries depicting the history of Cade's bloodline stretching back generations, and she felt, despite everything, a fresh wave of insecurity rising at the sheer scale of the world Cade had been born into, so far removed from the modest lodge of the Blackthorn pack that it seemed almost to belong to a different reality entirely. "You belong here as much as I do," Cade said quietly, noticing her hesitation as they approached the grand doors of the council chamber. "Don't let this place make you doubt that, even for a moment." Elena managed a small, grateful smile, though the nervous knot in her stomach remained as the doors swung open to reveal the assembled council, dozens of pack leaders and nobles seated around a vast circular table, their conversation dying instantly into stunned, disbelieving silence as Cade strode into the chamber with unmistakable authority. At the head of the table, a tall, silver-haired man rose slowly to his feet, his expression cycling rapidly through shock, calculation, and finally something that settled into careful, forced welcome. "Cade," he said, his voice carrying false warmth that did nothing to disguise the alarm beneath it. "We feared the worst." "I imagine you did, Halric," Cade replied, his voice deadly calm as he crossed the chamber, every eye in the room following his movement. "Given that you were the one who arranged for me to die in that forest." Gasps rippled through the assembled council, murmurs of shock and confusion breaking the earlier stunned silence. Halric's composure cracked visibly, though he recovered quickly, forcing an expression of wounded offense onto his features. "That's a serious accusation," he said, his voice tight. "I'd advise caution before making claims you can't support, Your Grace." Cade's expression did not waver. "Garrick," he said simply, and the loyal guard stepped forward, producing the documents they had gathered and spreading them across the table for the assembled leaders to see. I have your own correspondence, Halric, promising territory and favor to pack leaders willing to support your regency in the event of my death. Death you arranged personally, in the forest, 3 weeks past. The chamber erupted into chaos, pack leaders leaning forward to examine the documents, voices rising in accusation and disbelief as the full scope of Halric's betrayal became clear. Elena watched from just behind Cade, her heart pounding, as Halric's careful composure finally shattered entirely, his face draining of color, as leader after leader turned toward him with expressions of dawning fury. "This is fabricated," Halric protested, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence entirely, desperation bleeding through with every word. "Forged documents, meant to discredit me." "Then explain the seal," Garrick said coldly, pointing to the unmistakable mark pressed into the wax at the bottom of each letter. "Your own personal seal, Lord Halric, not easily forged, as you well know." The silence that followed was absolute, every pack leader in the chamber staring at Halric with expressions that left no doubt about how thoroughly his web of deception had just collapsed. Cade stepped forward slowly, his gold eyes hard and unforgiving, as he addressed the assembled council directly. "I was attacked in the forest 3 weeks ago," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "Wounded severely enough that survival was uncertain. I remained in hiding, not out of weakness, but out of necessity, to determine exactly who among my supposed allies had betrayed the oath they swore to me, and to this kingdom. I have my answer now." He turned to face Halric directly, and something in his posture shifted into something colder, more absolute, the full weight of his authority as Alpha King settling over the chamber like a physical presence. "Lord Halric," he said, "your title, lands, and standing among the pack leaders are hereby stripped, effective immediately. You will face judgment for treason, according to the ancient laws of this kingdom." Halric's composure finally broke entirely, desperation twisting his features as he looked around the chamber for any sign of support, and found none. Every pack leader who had once courted his favor, now regarding him with open disgust and betrayal of their own. Guards, summoned at Cade's signal, moved to restrain him, and Elena watched, a complicated mixture of relief and lingering unease settling in her chest, as the man responsible for Cade's near death was led from the chamber in chains. Once Halric had been removed, the assembled council turned their attention back to Cade, and the mood shifted noticeably, relief and renewed loyalty visible on faces that had, moments ago, been prepared to accept an usurper's rule. One by one, the pack leaders rose to reaffirm their allegiance, kneeling formally before Cade in a ceremony Elena watched with growing understanding of just how significant, how public, this reclamation of his authority truly was. It was only once the formal proceedings had concluded, the council beginning to disperse into smaller, quieter conversations about the aftermath of Halric's betrayal, that attention finally turned toward Elena, standing quietly at Cade's side throughout the entire dramatic confrontation. "Your Grace," one of the older pack leaders said carefully, approaching with obvious curiosity, "might we ask about your companion? Her presence here, beside you, during such a critical moment, suggests significance beyond simple travel companionship." Cade's expression shifted, something protective and proud passing across his features as he reached for Elena's hand, drawing her forward slightly beside him, with a gesture that left no room for ambiguity about his intentions. "This is Elena Voss," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the quieting chamber. "She found me in the forest after the attack, wounded and hidden, and cared for me through the worst of my recovery, without knowing who I was, or what danger that kindness might invite. I intend to formally claim her as my mate, before this council, and before every pack in this kingdom." The chamber fell into stunned silence once more, dozens of eyes turning toward Elena, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open surprise. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, the weight of so much attention settling heavily over her, but beneath the nervousness, she felt something else too. A fierce, steady pride at the public certainty in Cade's declaration, so different from the humiliation of Marcus's rejection, that it felt almost like a different world entirely. A murmur rippled through the assembled pack leaders, and Elena caught, among the general surprise, a few speculative glances that told her word of her origins. An Omega, with no pack, recently rejected, would likely spread through the kingdom before the day was finished. But Cade's grip on her hand remained steady, unwavering, and when she glanced up at him, The certainty in his gold eyes chased away any lingering doubt she might have felt. "Let them talk," he murmured quietly, only for her ears. "Whatever they say, it changes nothing about my choice." Elena felt something warm and fierce bloom in her chest at that, a certainty that whatever gossip or skepticism might follow, she stood now beside a king who had chosen her openly, completely, in front of the very council whose judgment mattered most in this kingdom. It was a stark, undeniable contrast to the ceremony that had once discarded her in front of an entire pack, and she found, standing there in the grand chamber with Cade's hand steady in hers, that the old wound of Marcus's rejection, finally, truly, began to heal. As the council chamber slowly emptied, pack leaders departing to spread word of Howrick's treason and Cade's dramatic return, Garrick approached quietly, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his usually composed expression. "Well done, Your Grace," he said. Then, with a nod toward Elena, "And to you as well, my lady. I don't think this kingdom has seen a return quite like that in generations." Elena managed a small laugh, some of the day's overwhelming tension finally beginning to ease. "I'm not sure I did much beyond staying beside him," she said. "You did more than you know," Cade said quietly, turning to look at her with an expression that held none of the cold authority he had shown Howrick, only warmth, gratitude, and something deeper still that made her breath catch. "You gave me a reason to fight for all of this again, when I might otherwise have simply disappeared to survive." Elena held his gaze, understanding the full weight of what he was telling her, and felt, standing there in the grand, ancient chamber of a kingdom she had never imagined herself belonging to, that she had finally found something worth staying for, something worth fighting for in return. But even as relief and quiet joy settled over the moment, Elena could not entirely shake a lingering unease. Word of her presence, her origins, her sudden and dramatic rise from rejected Omega to a king's claimed mate, would spread quickly now, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who had already survived one pack's judgment, that not everyone would receive the news with the same warmth Cade's counsel had shown. Somewhere, word would eventually reach Blackthorn territory, and Marcus, and the pack that had once discarded her so completely, and Elena found herself wondering, with a complicated mixture of dread and quiet, fierce satisfaction, exactly how that reckoning might unfold when it finally came. That evening, after the chaos of the council chamber had finally settled, and Howrick had been secured to await formal judgment, Cade led Elena through the royal seat to a private wing she had not yet seen, quieter than the grand public halls, with windows overlooking gardens that stretched down toward a distant, glittering lake. "This will be your wing, if you choose to stay," he said, watching her reaction carefully as she took in the spacious, elegant rooms, so different from anything she had known in Blackthorn territory. "I know all of this is overwhelming. I don't expect you to adjust to it overnight." Elena moved slowly through the rooms, trailing her fingers along a carved wooden banister, taking in the careful, deliberate beauty of a space clearly meant to welcome, rather than intimidate. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. "It's just a lot to imagine belonging here." Cade crossed to stand beside her at the window overlooking the gardens, close enough that his warmth reached her without needing to touch. "You already belong here," he said quietly. "The title, the formal recognition, that will take time to arrange properly. But the belonging itself, that already happened, back in the ruins, long before either of us understood what it meant." Elena leaned into him slightly, exhaustion from the enormous day finally catching up with her, and felt his arms settle protectively around her shoulders, steady and certain. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light of evening fade over the gardens below, the events of the day slowly settling into something that felt, despite its enormity, undeniably right. A servant arrived eventually with a simple meal, and Cade insisted Elena eat properly, before exhaustion overtook her entirely, the two of them settling at a small table near the window, rather than the grander dining hall Elena suspected existed somewhere else in the vast royal seat. The intimacy of the small, quiet meal reminded her of their first proper dinner together at the inn, and she found herself smiling faintly at the memory, at how far they had traveled together since that strange, wary first meal. "What are you thinking about?" Cade asked, noticing her expression. "Our first real meal together," she admitted, "at the inn. I remember being so nervous, not just about who you really were, but about everything that seemed to be changing so fast. It still feels that way, honestly, just on a much larger scale now. Cade reached across the small table, covering her hand with his own, the gesture familiar now, comfortable in a way that still managed to carry a spark of something deeper each time he did it. "We'll figure out the scale of it together," he said. "One day at a time, the same way we figured out everything else." Elena nodded, drawing comfort from the steady certainty in his voice, and as the evening deepened around them, the enormous weight of the day's events, Halrich's downfall, the council's reaffirmed loyalty, the public declaration of Cade's intentions toward her, gradually settled into something she could carry, not because it had become smaller, but because she no longer felt she carried it alone. "Tomorrow," Cade said eventually, as the meal wound down and true exhaustion began pulling at both of them, "we'll need to discuss the formal ceremony to recognize you properly, both as my mate and as this kingdom's future Luna. It won't be simple, and there will be those who question it, given how recently you arrived among us. But I intend to make your place here undeniable, regardless of any objection." Elena felt a flicker of nervousness at the mention of a formal ceremony, memories of her last significant pack ceremony rising unbidden, sharp and painful despite how much had changed since then. Cade seemed to sense the shift in her mood immediately, his expression softening with understanding. "This won't be like before," he said gently, correctly guessing the source of her sudden tension. "I promise you that. Whatever ceremony we hold, it will be a beginning, not an ending. A claiming, not a rejection." Elena held on to that promise as she finally allowed herself to rest that night, in a bed grander than any she had known, in a wing of a royal seat she was somehow, impossibly, meant to call home. Sleep came slowly, her mind still turning over everything the day had brought. But beneath the lingering nervousness, she found a quiet, steady thread of hope that had not existed in her life since long before Marcus had ever stood before their pack and spoken the words that ended everything she thought she understood about her own worth. Somewhere beyond the royal seat's high walls, news of Cade's dramatic return and Halrich's exposed treason was already spreading through the northern territories like wildfire carried on the wind, reaching pack after pack, until, inevitably, it would reach Blackthorn territory as well, and the pack that had so carelessly discarded an Omega who was now, by the king's own declaration, destined to become their Luna. The days following Halrich's fall brought a whirlwind of activity to the royal seat, preparations for the formal recognition ceremony, consuming nearly every waking hour, as advisors and attendants moved through the halls with the particular urgency of people determined to demonstrate their renewed loyalty through flawless execution. Elena found herself swept into fittings for formal attire, lessons in the customs and expectations of a Luna's role, and countless introductions to nobles and pack representatives, eager to secure favor with the woman their king had so publicly claimed. It was overwhelming in ways she had not fully anticipated, the sheer scale of expectations settling over her like an unfamiliar weight, and she found herself, more than once, retreating to quiet corners of the palace gardens, simply to breathe, to remember the quiet simplicity of those first strange days in the ruins, when nothing had mattered beyond survival, and the growing, wordless trust between herself and a wounded silver wolf. Cade found her during one such retreat, several days into the preparations, seated on a stone bench beneath a sprawling willow tree, near the edge of the garden lake. He settled beside her without a word at first, simply present, his warmth a familiar comfort, even amid the chaos of the palace beyond the garden walls. "It's a lot, isn't it?" he said eventually, watching her carefully. Elena let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I keep thinking I'll get used to it," she admitted. "And then someone else arrives to discuss seating arrangements, or the proper way to address a visiting pack leader, and I remember how completely unprepared I am for any of this." Cade's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, holding it with the same steady certainty that had anchored her through every uncertain moment since the storm. "You're not unprepared," he said. "You're simply new to it. There's a difference, and it isn't a permanent one." "I'm an Omega with no pack standing, Cade," she said quietly, some of her earlier insecurity resurfacing despite the progress of the past weeks. "The nobles here, they're polite to my face, but I've heard the whispers. They wonder what you see in someone so far beneath the position you're asking me to fill." Cade's jaw tightened, something fierce passing behind his gold eyes. "Let them wonder," he said, his voice carrying quiet conviction. "I've led this kingdom long enough to know that titles and rankings mean far less than character, than the courage to kneel beside a wounded stranger in a storm, without knowing or caring what he might be. That courage is worth more than any pack ranking these nobles are so proud of." Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at his words. The same overwhelming gratitude she had felt in the council chamber rising again now in this quieter, more private moment. "I just don't want to embarrass you," she admitted softly. "Or give your enemies more reason to question your judgment, after everything you've already fought to reclaim." Cade turned to face her fully, both hands now cupping hers, his gold eyes holding hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "You could never embarrass me," he said firmly. "Elena, you saved my life without knowing who I was. You stayed by my side through danger you didn't have to accept. You've faced every challenge since then, with more grace and courage than most nobles born to this life could manage. If anyone questions my judgment in choosing you, they understand nothing about what actually matters in a leader, or in a mate." The word mate settled between them with new weight, and Elena felt her pulse quicken, understanding that the formal ceremony approaching in just a few days would make that bond, still developing, still tentative in some ways despite everything they had already shared, permanent and undeniable before the entire kingdom. "Are you ready for that?" she asked quietly. "The full weight of the bond, not just the title, but everything it means between us." Cade's expression gentled further, and he lifted one hand to brush a strand of hair back from her face, the gesture achingly tender. "I've been ready since I heard your voice through that storm," he said. "I think some part of me knew, even then, before either of us understood what we'd found in each other. The only question that ever mattered was whether you would be ready, in your own time, without pressure or expectation." Elena considered the question honestly, thinking of everything the past weeks had taught her, about trust, about worth, about the difference between a bond built on obligation and one built on genuine, patient choice. "I think I've been ready for longer than I realized, too," she admitted. "I was just afraid to trust it, after everything Marcus taught me about how easily a bond can be broken." "This bond won't break," Cade said, his voice carrying a certainty that reached deep into her chest and settled there, warm and unshakable. "Not because I'm promising perfection. None of us can promise that. But because I choose you, deliberately, every day, not out of some passing instinct, but out of genuine understanding of who you are, and what you've already proven yourself to be." Elena leaned into him then, resting her head against his shoulder, watching the quiet ripples of the garden lake catching the afternoon light. "Tell me about the ceremony," she said eventually. "What actually happens, beyond the parts the attendants have already explained?" Cade's arm settled around her shoulders, and he spoke quietly, describing the ancient rites that would formally bind them, not just as mates in the simple sense the Blackthorn ceremony had once celebrated between herself and Marcus, but as sovereign and Luna, a bond recognized and honored by every pack under his authority. As he spoke, Elena felt the last of her earlier anxiety, gradually easing, replaced by a steady, growing anticipation for what lay ahead. In the days that followed, as final preparations for the ceremony continued, Elena found herself growing more confident in her new role, aided in no small part by Cade's constant, quiet support, and by the gradually warming attitudes of nobles and attendants who, seeing the genuine bond between their king and his chosen mate, began to extend real warmth rather than mere polite tolerance. Garrick, too, proved an unexpected source of comfort during this transition, his easy humor and evident loyalty to Cade extending naturally into genuine friendship with Elena as the days passed. He took it upon himself to teach her small, practical details of palace life that the more formal attendants overlooked, which servants could be trusted with honest questions, which nobles' apparent friendliness masked genuine ambition, small kindnesses that made the overwhelming transition feel more manageable. "You've got good instincts," he told her one afternoon, as they walked together through the palace halls while Cade attended to matters of state Elena was not yet expected to navigate. Most people thrown into this world overnight would have crumbled under the pressure. "You're adapting faster than anyone expected, myself included." Elena managed a small, grateful smile at that. "I had good practice surviving unexpected disaster," she said, a touch of dark humor coloring her words. "Getting rejected in front of an entire pack tends to prepare you for handling difficult situations, with whatever grace you can manage." Garrick's expression sobered slightly at that, something sympathetic passing behind his eyes. "For what it's worth," he said, "whatever pack was foolish enough to let you go, clearly never understood what they had. Cade's court is fortunate to have gained what Blackthorn so carelessly lost." Elena felt warmth at the sincerity in his words, a growing sense that the family she had lost in that storm was being replaced, gradually, by a new kind of belonging she had never expected to find. As the day of the ceremony finally approached, she found herself facing it not with the dread and uncertainty that had colored her thoughts in those first overwhelming days, but with a steady, growing confidence in the bond she and Cade had built together, forged not in the easy comfort of privilege, but in storm and ruin and patient, deliberate choice. The night before the ceremony, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion of endless preparations, Elena found herself once again drawn to the quiet of the garden, moonlight silvering the surface of the lake in a way that reminded her, sharply and unexpectedly, of the storm that had first brought her and Cade together. She sat on the same stone bench beneath the willow tree, wrapped in a warm shawl against the cool night air, thinking of everything that had led her to this moment. She did not hear Cade approach until he settled beside her, his presence as familiar now as her own heartbeat. "Couldn't sleep either," he observed, though it was not really a question. "Too much to think about," she admitted. "Tomorrow feels enormous, in a way even the council chamber didn't quite manage." Cade nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. "It is enormous," he agreed, "but enormous doesn't have to mean frightening. Tomorrow, we're not facing danger or betrayal. We're simply making official what already exists between us." Elena considered his words, letting them settle over the nervous energy that had kept her from sleep. "Tell me something," she said after a moment. "Before all of this, before Halric, before you were forced into hiding, what kind of king were you? What did an ordinary day look like for you?" Cade's expression turned thoughtful, a small, genuine smile touching his mouth as he considered the question. "Busy," he admitted. "Council meetings, disputes between pact territories to settle, trade negotiations with the southern kingdoms. It probably sounds tedious compared to storms and rescued wolves and confrontations with traitors." "It sounds like a life," Elena said softly. "A real one, with routine and purpose, not just crisis after crisis." Cade glanced at her, something warm and curious in his expression. "Does that frighten you?" he asked. "The ordinary parts, as much as the dramatic ones?" Elena thought about it honestly before answering. "No," she said finally. "I think I'm looking forward to the ordinary parts, actually. After everything that's happened, I think I'd like to know what it feels like to build a quiet life with someone, not just survive dramatic circumstances together." Something in Cade's expression softened further at that, and he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the easy familiarity that had grown between them over these past weeks. "Then that's what I intend to give you," he said quietly. "Once the ceremony is done, once the kingdom has settled back into stability, I want that too. Quiet mornings, ordinary disagreements about small things that don't matter, a life built slowly, together, rather than forged entirely in crisis." Elena leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, as she had come to do so naturally over these past weeks, watching moonlight ripple across the surface of the lake. "I like the sound of that," she murmured. They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while, the quiet of the garden broken only by the gentle sounds of the night, until finally, gently, Cade spoke again. "Are you ready?" he asked. "For tomorrow, and for everything after it?" Elena considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, thinking of the storm, the ruins, the wolf who had become a king, and the surprising steady bond that had grown between them, despite every reason it should not have. "I think I've been ready since the moment I chose to follow your howl instead of turning back," she said finally. "Everything since then has just been learning how to trust that choice." Cade pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, and Elena felt the last of her nervous uncertainty finally settle into something calm, something certain, as she looked forward, for the first time without fear, toward the life waiting for her on the other side of tomorrow's ceremony. The morning of the ceremony arrived bright and clear, the palace grounds transformed overnight into something out of the old stories Elena's grandmother used to tell. Silver banners bearing the royal crest hung from every archway, flowers imported from warmer southern territories filling the air with sweetness, and rows of seating stretching across the great outer courtyard to accommodate the pack leaders and nobles who had traveled from across the kingdom to witness their king's formal claiming of his mate. Elena stood in the private chamber adjoining her wing, watching in the mirror as attendants added the final touches to attire far grander than anything she had worn in her life. A gown the color of moonlight on water, deliberately chosen, she suspected, to echo the shimmer of Cade's silver wolf form. Her hair had been carefully arranged, woven through with small silver ornaments that caught the light with every small movement. "You look every bit the Luna this kingdom deserves," one of the older attendants said warmly, adjusting the final fold of the gown's train. "Whatever doubts anyone in this palace once held about your worthiness, they'll be silenced the moment you walk through those doors." Elena managed a nervous smile, gratitude for the woman's kindness settling some of the anxious flutter in her stomach. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of your help these past days. I know I've been slow to learn everything expected of me." "You've learned faster than most," the attendant said firmly. "And more importantly, my lady, you've learned it with genuine humility, which is rarer among nobles born to privilege than you might expect." Before Elena could respond further, a soft knock at the door announced Garrick's arrival, dressed formally for the occasion, in a manner that looked almost unfamiliar compared to his usual practical traveling gear. His expression, when he saw her, shifted immediately into something warm and approving. "His Grace sent me to escort you," he said, "though I suspect he mostly wanted an excuse to know you were on your way, given how many times he's asked after your progress this morning." Elena laughed despite her nerves, the sound easing some of the remaining tension in her chest. "Then I suppose we shouldn't keep him waiting any longer," she said. The walk through the palace halls toward the courtyard felt both impossibly long and impossibly short, every step carrying her closer to a moment that would formally transform her entire life, and Elena found herself grateful for Garrick's steady, reassuring presence beside her, his easy conversation about small, unimportant things, helping keep her nerves from overwhelming her entirely. When they finally reached the entrance to the courtyard, the assembled crowd visible through the grand doors, hundreds of faces turned expectantly toward the entrance. Elena felt her breath catch entirely, the scale of the moment settling over her with sudden, overwhelming weight. Then her eyes found Cade, standing at the far end of the courtyard, beneath an arch of silver and white flowers, dressed in formal attire that made him look every bit the king his people needed to see, and something in his expression, warm and steady and utterly certain, chased away the last of her overwhelming nervousness. She began the long walk down the aisle between the assembled guests, aware of countless eyes following her progress, murmurs rippling through the crowd, but she kept her focus fixed on Cade, on the promise in his gold eyes, and found that the distance between them felt shorter with every step rather than longer. It was as she neared the halfway point of the aisle that a disturbance at the edge of the courtyard caught her attention. A small group of latecomers being quietly directed to available seating by palace attendants, their travel-worn appearance, and the distinctive markings of their formal attire, immediately, sickeningly familiar to her. Blackthorn Pack. Elena's steps faltered slightly as recognition settled over her, spotting among the small group the unmistakable figure of Marcus, along with several pack elders she recognized instantly, despite the months since she had last seen them. Word of Cade's dramatic return, and his intention to claim a new Luna, had clearly reached Blackthorn territory, and the pack that had so thoroughly discarded her had apparently decided that attendance at this ceremony, whatever their private feelings, was a political necessity they could not afford to skip. Cade, watching her reaction from across the courtyard, immediately understood what had caused her hesitation, his expression hardening slightly, even as he remained perfectly composed for the watching crowd. Elena forced herself to continue walking, refusing to let the unexpected presence of her former pack derail the moment she had worked so hard to reach, though her heart pounded with a complicated mixture of anger, old hurt, and fierce, unexpected satisfaction. By the time she reached the end of the aisle, Cade's hand extending to meet hers beneath the flowered arch, she had steadied herself enough to meet his eyes with genuine warmth, rather than lingering distraction. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent reassurance that whatever Blackthorn's presence meant, it would not overshadow what mattered most about this day. The ceremony proceeded with the solemn, ancient formality Elena had learned to expect from her lessons. an elder priestess presiding over vows and rites that bound Cade and Elena together, not merely as mates, but as sovereign, and Luna, their combined authority formally recognized before every pack leader present. Elena spoke her vows with a steadiness that surprised even herself, her earlier nervousness settling into calm, certain purpose, as she looked into Cade's gold eyes and promised herself to him, fully and completely, before the entire assembled kingdom. When the final rite was complete, the priestess declaring the bond formally sealed, a great cheer rose from the assembled crowd, and Elena felt the last remnants of her old, discarded identity finally, completely give way to something new, something chosen rather than rejected, celebrated rather than dismissed. It was during the celebration that followed, as guests mingled through the courtyard and gardens beyond, that Marcus finally approached, flanked by two Blackthorn elders, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of shame and forced diplomatic composure that Elena recognized immediately as calculated rather than genuine. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Cade first, with careful deference, before turning to Elena. "And Your Grace," he added, the title clearly uncomfortable in his mouth, given the history between them. "Congratulations on your union. Blackthorn Pack wishes you both great fortune in your reign." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for some trace of genuine remorse beneath the diplomatic formality, and found little beyond obvious calculation, the recognition of a man who understood, belatedly, exactly how catastrophic his earlier decision had been, now that the discarded Omega he had rejected stood before him as a king's Luna. "Thank you, Marcus," she said finally, her voice carrying a calm, steady dignity that surprised even herself. "I hope Blackthorn understands the responsibility that comes with maintaining good standing under this crown, going forward." Something flickered in Marcus's expression at the pointed warning beneath her polite words, and Cade, standing close beside her, allowed a small, cold smile to touch his mouth that left no doubt about how thoroughly he understood the exchange taking place. "Blackthorn standing under this crown," he said, his voice carrying quiet authority, "will be evaluated carefully in the coming months. I trust you'll understand my particular interest in ensuring that pack treats every member of its territory with the honor they deserve, going forward." The threat, though delivered with perfect diplomatic composure, was unmistakable, and Marcus paled visibly, understanding fully now the precarious position his pack's earlier cruelty had placed them in. He offered a hasty, formal bow, before retreating with the elders, leaving Elena and Cade alone, once more, amid the celebration. "That felt strange," Elena admitted quietly, watching Marcus disappear back into the crowd. "Not painful exactly, just strange, seeing him again after everything." Cade's arm settled around her waist, warm and steady. "Strange is understandable," he said. "You don't owe that pack forgiveness, Elena, not unless you choose to offer it freely. But you also don't have to carry the weight of what they did to you any longer than you want to. Today isn't about them. It's about what we've built despite them." Elena nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her, and as the celebration continued around them, laughter and music filling the gardens as the sun began its slow descent toward evening, she found that Marcus's presence, however unwelcome, no longer carried the power to diminish the joy of the day. She had built something entirely her own here, chosen and celebrated rather than discarded, and no amount of Blackthorn's belated diplomacy could take that from her now. As evening settled over the palace grounds, the formal celebration gradually giving way to quieter, more intimate gatherings among close friends and trusted advisors, Elena found herself standing beside Cade near the edge of the garden lake once more, watching the last light of day fade into the soft glow of countless lanterns strung through the surrounding trees. "Any regrets?" Cade asked quietly, watching her expression in the lantern light. Elena considered the question seriously, thinking of the storm, the rejection, the long, uncertain path that had led her from Blackthorn's ceremony grounds to this moment, standing as Luna beside a king who had chosen her completely. "None," she said finally, with absolute certainty. "Not one." Cade's expression softened into something achingly tender, and he drew her close, resting his forehead against hers in a gesture more intimate than any grand ceremony could capture. "Then, let's build the rest of it together," he murmured. "Whatever comes next, ordinary or extraordinary, we build it together, starting tonight." Elena closed her eyes, breathing in the warmth of his presence, the quiet certainty of a bond forged not in easy privilege, but in storm and ruin and patient, deliberate choice, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely, completely at peace with exactly who she had become. 2 days after the ceremony, once the celebrations had finally quieted and the visiting pack leaders had begun their journeys home, a formal request arrived from the Blackthorn elders, asking for a private audience with the newly recognized Luna before their own departure. Elena read the request with a complicated tangle of emotions, old hurt mixing uneasily with the new, steady confidence that had grown in her since the storm. "You don't have to grant this," Cade told her, watching her study the formal parchment with careful attention. "Whatever they want to say, you owe them nothing, especially not your time or patience." "I know," Elena said slowly, "but I think I want to hear them out anyway. Not for their sake, for mine. I think I need to close that chapter properly, rather than just leaving it hanging unresolved." Cade nodded, respecting her decision, even as concern remained visible in his expression. "Then I'll be there with you," he said, "not to speak for you, but simply so you're not facing them alone." The audience took place in a smaller, more private chamber than the Grand Council room, Elena seated with quiet dignity, while Cade stood close behind her, his presence a steady, silent support, as the Blackthorn elders were shown in. Marcus was among them again, along with the pack's aging alpha, Cedric, whose stern expression carried none of the arrogance Elena remembered from her years in the pack, replaced instead by something that looked, genuinely this time, like shame. "Your Grace," Cedric began, addressing Elena with a formality she had never once received during her years as an Omega in his pack, "we come to formally apologize for the treatment you received under Blackthorn's authority. What was done to you at that ceremony was a failure of leadership on my part, a failure I take full responsibility for." Elena studied him carefully, searching for genuine remorse beneath the careful diplomatic language, and found, to her surprise, something that seemed sincere rather than merely calculated, though she remained cautious about trusting the difference too readily. "The rejection ceremony that day cost me everything I thought I understood about my place in the world," she said quietly. "I nearly died in that storm, alone, with nowhere to go and no pack willing to claim responsibility for what happened to me. That's not a small failure, Cedric. That's a fundamental betrayal of everything a pack is supposed to protect." Cedric's expression tightened with visible discomfort, but he did not argue the point. "You're right," he said, "and I understand that no apology can undo what was done. I only hope that some measure of restitution might be possible, going forward, both for you personally and for how Blackthorn treats its Omegas in the future." Elena glanced briefly at Cade, drawing strength from his steady presence, before turning back to address the assembled elders directly. "I'm not interested in punishing Blackthorn for the sake of punishment," she said finally. "What happened to me was wrong, and I won't pretend otherwise. But I'd rather see that wrong become the reason real change happens, both within your pack and across every territory under this crown, than simply extract satisfaction from watching you suffer for it." "What kind of change?" Marcus asked quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the chamber. Elena held his gaze steadily, memories of their shared childhood mixing uneasily with the deep hurt of his public rejection, before she answered. "New protections," she said. "Formal standing for Omegas that cannot be revoked through simple ceremony or convenience. Real consequences for packs that discard vulnerable members without proper care or provision for their safety. I want to work with the Crown to ensure that no Omega ever again faces what I faced in that storm, alone and unprotected, simply because a mate bond didn't work out the way everyone expected." Cade stepped forward slightly at that, his hand resting supportively on Elena's shoulder. "I intend to support these reforms fully," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a king, already resolved on the matter. "Blackthorn, and every pack under this crown, will be expected to meet new standards for the protection and treatment of Omegas, effective immediately. Compliance will be monitored, and consequences for failure will be significant." The Blackthorn elders exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them argued the point, understanding clearly the precarious position their pack occupied given recent events. Cedric bowed formally, acceptance evident in his posture. "We'll implement whatever standards the Crown establishes," he said. "And your Grace," he added, addressing Elena directly once more. "For what it's worth, Blackthorn is fortunate that the Omega we so carelessly discarded, became someone capable of transforming that failure into meaningful change, rather than simple vengeance. Elena nodded, accepting the acknowledgement with quiet dignity, and as the Blackthorn delegation departed a short while later, she felt something settle in her chest. Not quite forgiveness, not entirely, but something adjacent to it, a sense of resolution that allowed the old wound to finally begin closing, rather than simply festering beneath the surface of her new life. "That went better than I expected," Cade observed once they were alone again, settling beside her with obvious relief evident in his relaxed posture. "I think I needed that," Elena admitted. Not their apology exactly, though that mattered too, but the chance to turn what happened to me into something that protects others, going forward. It makes the pain feel less pointless, somehow. Cade drew her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. "That's not a small thing," he murmured. "Most people carry old wounds without ever finding a way to transform them into something meaningful. You've managed that in a matter of weeks, Elena. That's remarkable." Elena leaned into him, feeling the last lingering tension of the difficult audience finally ease from her shoulders, and found herself thinking, not for the first time, of how completely her life had transformed since that terrible night in the storm. From an Omega discarded and alone, to a Luna capable of reshaping an entire kingdom's treatment of the vulnerable. The path had been unexpected, dangerous, and often frightening, but standing here now, in the quiet aftermath of confronting her old pack with newfound strength and purpose, she would not have traded a single moment of the journey that had brought her here. In the weeks that followed the Blackthorn audience, the kingdom began to settle into a new, steadier rhythm under Cade's reaffirmed authority, the last traces of Halrich's brief attempt at usurpation fading as trials concluded. Punishments were formally rendered, and the pack leaders, who had once wavered in their loyalty, gradually rebuilt trust through consistent, visible commitment to the crown's renewed stability. Elena, for her part, threw herself into the work of establishing the new protections for Omegas that she and Cade had promised during that difficult audience with Blackthorn, meeting with legal advisors and pack representatives from across the kingdom to draft formal standards that would ensure no Omega faced the kind of sudden, unprotected rejection she herself had survived. It was demanding work, requiring her to relive difficult memories in service of preventing similar pain for others. But she found in it a purpose that steadied her, transforming old wounds into something that mattered far beyond her own individual healing. Garrick proved an invaluable ally throughout this process, using his extensive knowledge of pack politics to help identify which territories were likely to resist the new standards and which strategies might smooth their implementation. His easy friendship, along with the growing warmth of the palace staff who had come to genuinely respect and care for their new Luna, helped Elena feel increasingly settled in a life that had once felt overwhelmingly foreign. "You've changed this palace more than you realize," Garrick told her one afternoon, as they reviewed draft legislation together in the palace library. "Before you arrived, this place ran on formality and careful distance. You've brought something warmer into it, something the staff, and even some of the more stubborn nobles have responded to more than I expected." Elena smiled at that, setting aside the document she had been reviewing. "I think I just refused to pretend I was someone I wasn't," she said. "It turns out that's harder to dismiss than expected, even in a place this formal." It was nearly 2 months after the ceremony that the day finally arrived for Elena's formal coronation, as Luna, a separate, even grander ceremony than her mate claiming had been, one that would formally establish her authority alongside Cade's in matters of governance across the entire kingdom. The scale of preparation dwarfed even the earlier ceremony, representatives arriving from every pack territory under the crown's authority, along with dignitaries from neighboring kingdoms eager to witness the formal establishment of the reign that had survived and triumphed over Halrich's betrayal. Standing once more in her private chamber, as attendants made final adjustments to a gown even grander than the one she had worn for her mating ceremony, silver thread woven through pale fabric in patterns that echoed the shimmer of Cade's wolf form, Elena found herself remarkably calm compared to the nervous uncertainty of that earlier day. "You look ready," one of the attendants observed, noting the steady confidence in Elena's expression as she studied her own reflection. "I think I finally am," Elena admitted, and meant it fully for the first time. When Cade arrived to escort her personally to the ceremony, a departure from tradition that he had insisted upon despite his advisor's mild concerns about protocol, His expression carried an unmistakable pride that warmed her more than any formal compliment could have managed. "You've earned every bit of what's about to happen," he said quietly, taking her hand as they prepared to walk together toward the grand courtyard where the entire kingdom's leadership waited. "Not because of the title, but because of everything you've already done with the position, even before it's formally recognized." The walk to the courtyard felt entirely different from her earlier procession toward the mating ceremony, not because the crowd was smaller, if anything it was larger, drawing representatives from territories that had not attended the earlier, more hastily arranged ceremony, but because Elena herself had changed so completely in the months between the two events. She walked now not as a woman, uncertain of her place in an overwhelming new world, but as someone who had earned her standing through demonstrated commitment to the people she now served. The formal rites of coronation proceeded with solemn grandeur, an ancient crown of silver, worked with intricate detail that seemed to catch and hold the light in patterns reminiscent of moonlight on water, lowered carefully onto Elena's head by the same elder priestess who had presided over her mating ceremony months before. As the final words of the ancient rite were spoken, formally establishing her authority as Luna across every pack under Cade's crown, a great cheer rose from the assembled crowd, genuine and warm in a way that told Elena, more clearly than any formal declaration could have, that she had truly earned her place among these people. Cade, standing beside her as the ceremony concluded, turned to face the assembled crowd with obvious pride evident in every line of his posture. "My people," he said, his voice carrying easily across the vast courtyard. "Today we formally recognize the Luna, who has already proven herself worthy of this crown many times over, not through birthright or privilege, but through courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to protecting those our kingdom has too often overlooked. Let this coronation stand as reminder that true worth is measured not by the pack one is born into, but by the character one chooses to embody, regardless of circumstance." The crowd's response was thunderous, genuine warmth and celebration filling the courtyard, as the formal ceremony gave way to festivities that would continue long into the evening. Elena, standing beside Cade as the celebration unfolded around them, felt the weight of the silver crown settle over her, not as burden, but as recognition of a journey that had begun in storm and rejection, and had, against every expectation, led her here, to a life chosen and celebrated rather than discarded. As evening finally settled over the palace grounds, the formal celebrations quieting into the same intimate gathering of trusted friends that had marked the end of her mating ceremony months before, Elena found herself once again at the edge of the garden lake with Cade, moonlight silvering the water's surface, in the same way it had on that quiet night before her wedding. "Any regrets?" Cade asked again, echoing his earlier question with a small, knowing smile. Elena considered the question with the same seriousness she had given it before, thinking now of everything the past months had brought, the storm, the ruins, the rejection that had once felt like an ending but had become, instead, the beginning of everything that truly mattered. "None," she said again, with even greater certainty than before. "Not one single moment of it." Cade drew her close, resting his forehead against hers beneath the silver crown that now marked her as Luna of the Northern Kingdom. "Then let's keep building," he murmured. "Not just the ordinary life we talked about before, though I still want that too, but everything else, the protections for Omegas like you once were, the strength of this kingdom, the family I hope we'll build together in time, all of it, starting from tonight, and continuing for as long as we're given." Elena closed her eyes, breathing in the warmth of the man who had become, against every expectation born that terrible night in the storm, not just her mate, but her partner in every sense that truly mattered, and felt, standing there beneath the silver moon with a crown of her own upon her head, that she had finally, completely become someone worthy of the love and respect she had once believed she would never find again. The Howl that had called her through that storm so many months ago had led her farther than she ever could have imagined, not simply to safety, but to purpose, to partnership, to a version of herself stronger and more certain than the frightened, discarded Omega who had fled into the darkness that night. And as she stood now beside her king, her mate, her partner in building something lasting from the wreckage of what rejection had once tried to destroy, Elena Voss understood, finally and completely, that some endings are simply the storm before an entirely new beginning.